I grew up in Australia, in a fairly rural area, on a cow farm. My favourite memories of being on the farm was spending time with my father on Saturday mornings. I had two younger brothers who were both asthmatics, so they didn't spend time out on the farm, which made spending time with my dad more special to me. That was the only one-on-one time that I got to spend with him.
Andrew Facey, Brooklyn's father, is a wealthy fourth-generation real estate developer in Melbourne.
When I was a kid, I thought my dad was a superhero. He took over his father's real estate business when he was 18 years old, and he expanded the business very significantly.
Brooklyn's mother is a beautiful socialite.
I had a very difficult relationship with my mother. There was the expectation that I was going to be as thin and as beautiful as what she was. And it didn't seem to matter what I did. It was never good enough for her. And it's caused a significant amount of trauma in my life.
Brooklyn wants to follow in her father's footsteps one day, but here too, she meets with rejection.
My intention was to take over the family business, but my father is somewhat old school in that he likes to keep the men in the business and the women at home.
Her dad does agree to support her financially, and Brooklyn sets her sights on college. But then, disaster strikes.
When I was 18 years old, I had a head-on collision with a truck. I had a closed head injury, my face and jaw was smashed, and I have since had 54 orthopedic surgeries to rebuild my body. I spent most of the year either in a wheelchair or on crutches, but I managed to get through that year at college.
Brooklyn eventually finishes her degree, but rethinks her future.
I couldn't spend time standing and on my feet all day, which is what's required if you're in real estate. One of the things that interested me was esthetician. So I did a course in that, and then I opened my own business in a gym in Melbourne. I met my first husband at the gym after one of the surgeries. After my car accident, I felt like I had been smashed into pieces, and I felt that nobody was going to want me. So as soon as somebody did come along that appeared interested in me, I feel like I kind of latched onto that.
The couple marry in 1996 when Brooklyn is 27, and she gives birth to her first son a year later.
By the time I was pregnant with my second son, I was working and I had a toddler, and my patience with my husband was really just running low. I said to him, "You're going to have to go because you're not pulling your weight."
After 5 years of marriage, Brooklyn takes full custody of her sons with minimal resistance from her ex. A year later, she's ready to dip her toes back into the dating pool.
For anyone who's been a single mother, it's an exhausting gig. And I hoped that I would find someone who would come in and be a part of the family and contribute to that. So I signed up for an Australian dating online service.
She met Paul Carter on RSVP, the online dating site. He came across to her as very available. He was single, unmarried, without children, and looking for love.
So the next night I went on my first date with Paul Carter. And that was a date with destiny, to say the least. Paul showed up in a bright yellow sports car, and that epitomized Paul's personality. He was flashy, he was showy. We went out for dinner and we laughed and talked and got on great, and he was just very easy to talk to, and we just kind of clicked. He has a big personality and he is an amusing person to spend time with.
Paul is ambitious and has his sights set on a bright financial future as a real estate developer and independent business owner.
I needed a man that was going to step up, somebody that had the sort of alpha male qualities that my dad had. That's how Paul came across initially. We got romantically involved pretty quickly from that point. I had come from being married to somebody who was really not physically interested in me at all. And here was this guy, he was very sexual and a great lover. And I appealed to him. That made me feel great.
Eventually, Brooklyn introduces her sons to Paul.
My middle son was about 18 months old and my eldest son was about 4. And he got along great with them and he was happy to play with them and spend time with them, and so they thought he was great.
For 6 months, the four are spending all of their weekend time together. Eventually, work intervenes and Paul says he has to focus on some business matters.
He says that he can't see me this weekend. Okay, that's fine, no problem. I thought it was because he was trying to get stuff done. I ended up going to the South Melbourne market and I'm wandering around the market and I look up and here's Paul walking towards me hand in hand with a girl that I had no idea who she was. And he couldn't get her to let go of his hand fast enough. And I said to him, "What are you doing here?" And he said, "Oh, I'm just showing so-and-so around Melbourne. She's here visiting from Canada." And I couldn't even think at that point. Like, I couldn't think of anything to say. I was left standing there like an idiot, in shock. And when I finally got to ask him about it, his explanation was, "Oh, I was holding her hand because she was scared. She was scared." He claims that she just showed up unannounced. Nobody flies from Canada to Australia on a whim. I'm not somebody that strings people out or plays games, so I wasn't at that time familiar with being played the way that he was playing me. I started to get suspicious. I couldn't understand why I was never invited to his place. So one day when he was in the shower, I pulled his driver's license from his wallet and got his address. His name on his driver's license was Paul Carter, but the address didn't really fit with the narrative that he was putting up about being this super successful guy and having all these designer brands and this flashy car. And I thought, okay, well, I'll go pay a visit and see what's going on at this house. I pull up to the house and I knocked on the door, and this older man, Paul's dad, answered the door. And I said, "Is Paul Carter here?" And he said, "Do you mean Paul Cristallo?" And I said, "No, Paul Carter. This is his address." He said, "Well, Paul Cristallo lives here with his wife, Sonia, and he has 3 kids from his previous marriage." I couldn't believe what I was hearing. It was surreal. I have 2 little boys who are becoming quite attached to him. And there was a sideboard just inside the door and it had all these photos from their wedding, the pictures of the kids, pictures of his wife. And I felt like the ground was going to open up and swallow me.
Brooklyn Facey is reeling from the news that her new boyfriend, Paul Carter, is not the successful single man he claims to be. In fact, he's married with kids.
This was his second marriage that he was in. At that point, the first marriage, he had 3 kids. And he has a different last name. At this point, I'm starting to wonder if anything about him is real.
Brooklyn decides to confront Paul, who simply shrugs it off.
He says, yes, I'm married, but we're separated and we're just living in the house together. It didn't sound unrealistic. I thought, this guy's got a lot of potential. He was an exciting person. He's not boring like my last husband was. In hindsight, I should have just stuck with boring.
After the painful confrontation, Paul divorces his second wife and moves into an apartment. And soon, the deception is in the rear view as he plays dad to a blended family with Brooklyn.
He had 3 young children. I had 2 young children. Their ages sort of meshed together. Every other weekend, we had all 5 of them. I loved having the kids there. It was a lot of work for sure, but my boys were happy to have playmates. Thought Paul was pretty good with helping with things around the house, and he was involved in everything that they were doing. So we had a pretty good team situation going on. It meant a great deal to me because I was looking for a partner.
In March 2003, 8 months after first meeting Paul, he surprises Brooklyn with a grand gesture.
Paul proposed to me at the beach. He got down on one knee and asked me to marry him. I was thrilled. I was so excited. He convinced me that the life that we were going to have together was going to be wonderful. I didn't really get a sense that my parents didn't like him until I said to them that we were getting married, and they were not in favour of the idea. Right from the get-go, my father thought Paul was sketchy and he couldn't put his finger on it. But, you know, I was an adult. I was in my 30s by that stage, and I was going to do what I was going to do. So we got married on St Kilda Beach in Melbourne. My father came to the wedding. My mother did not come to the wedding. We had all the kids there, all dressed up in black pants and white shirts, and it was so beautiful. And everything seemed so perfect that day. I finally felt like I had the family that I had not had for my whole life. And I was the mother in the family, and I was never going to let my kids feel lonely or sad or unloved. Just thought that was the beginning of the happily ever after. So after we got married, the first couple of years were kind of rough. I was dealing with chronic pain from my car accident, but I felt like Paul had my back. I felt like he was there for me. For the most part, he seemed to be on my team.
The couple doesn't have to worry about money. Brooklyn may be cut out of running the family business, but her dad is still supportive. They move into a bigger house, and when she starts feeling healthier, they take another big step.
We decided to have a child together, and we had Mac, who is the love of my life, and he is my heart and soul.
After Mac's birth, Brooklyn and Paul buy an outdoor equipment company to run as a family business.
I was hoping that it would be something that we could work together in, and then there would be like a legacy for our kids. I was working there part-time, and I was doing the books, and Paul was selling the items, and he was very creative with his marketing, and he would start selling things on eBay. My dad injected a very significant amount of money so we could try and, make a go of it. He was trying to protect me financially, and he wanted to help Paul create something that was going to be good for us.
But after 18 months, they don't have enough cash flow to replenish their stock.
Paul was spending more money than he was bringing in. It wasn't until he was working for something that I was involved in that I got a glimpse of his poor business practices. And my dad basically bailed us out of it. So once we lost the company, my dad then had that over me. And I was going to hear about that forever and a day, that he had saved me and that otherwise we would have been bankrupt. Paul really did a good job of putting a wedge between us.
In 2010, Paul was appointed the CEO of United Housing Victoria, which is a publicly funded community housing company, and there he ran big sort of multi-million-dollar construction jobs.
The organization provides housing for low-income families.
He manages to pull this great job with United Housing, a very secure job, paying very well, and I'm thinking, great, everything's back on track now. I had no idea that he was doing anything wrong at the time.
He was let go after 2 years because they saw they were just hemorrhaging money. The suspicion was that Paul was blowing out the contracts of these construction jobs and pocketing that money.
Brooklyn and Paul have huge mortgage payments for the house they own together, and their debts are mounting because of Paul's excessive spending.
I was panic-stricken, and Paul's way of placating me was to say, I'll just pick up extra jobs on the side. We were in a bad place in our marriage. We ended up having to sell the house. My dad was furious. He was telling me that Paul doesn't know what he's doing. I was humiliated, totally humiliated. The fact that Paul was so irresponsible with money was another reason that my dad felt that he was not a good influence on the boys and that they would be better off with their biological father. He was putting pressure on my ex-husband. My father said to him, I will pay for your lawyers and I will put the kids through school. They took me to court and they filed for custody of my sons.
The custody battle continues for 3 years.
I had run out of money for lawyers. I had no chance of winning. No chance.
Finally, in 2013, Brooklyn loses custody of her 2 oldest sons, who are now 12 and 15. Perhaps influenced by their grandfather, they choose to side with their father.
So my ex-husband, he allowed my father to do this, and he really hasn't worked a day since then. There's only one thing that I really take pride in, and that is that I think I'm a good mum. And for me to lose my kids like that was just so devastating. If it wasn't for Mac, it would have been the end of me.
But for Brooklyn, these losses are just the beginning. Brooklyn Carter is staggering from the heartbreaking loss of her custody battle.
My family, I have no connection with because they've all taken my dad's side. I've lost 2 of my sons, so all I have left is my youngest son and my husband. It would have been easier for me if I had died that day. Everything that I had tried to keep safe and everything that mattered to me had just been handed over to someone else. And I just hope that when my boys are older, they realize that I never, ever stopped loving them. For a long time, I was so focused on the court battle with my kids that I was not paying attention to my husband. He felt that he was missing out on time and energy that I should have been putting into him. He was going to motocross meetings and joining motocross clubs. He was buying cars and changing cars frequently.
Paul would use Brooklyn to subsidise his lifestyle, things like fast cars, properties, credit cards.
There was constant stress in the house. Bills needed to be paid.
Brooklyn has managed to protect a portion of her nest egg from Paul's spending, but she's concerned he might eventually drain all of her money.
I really didn't have a lot of options other than to take back control myself. And my version of that was to take my money and put it somewhere else where Paul couldn't touch it, and I knew it would be safe. So we got an E2 treaty visa, which is granted to Australians who invest into a business in the United States. We had been to Boston to visit, and I loved it there. So I bought a couple of houses and rented them out.
Coincidentally, just as Brooklyn ties up her finances with offshore real estate and her money is out of his reach, Paul comes into a windfall.
On my son Mac's 5th birthday, we were having a party at our house for him, and Paul announced to me that he had inherited a large plot of land from his grandmother, and the government were trying to buy that land because they wanted to put a highway through.
Paul explains that this land is in Italy, and the sale is slightly delayed by red tape.
He showed me some documentation, and it all looked very bona fide to me, which was incredibly exciting because he was telling me that it was worth tens of millions of dollars. And that's one of the things about Paul. He always bounces back, often bigger and better than he was before.
Brooklyn feels hope for the first time since losing custody of her oldest sons. But she's worried how their absence is affecting Mac, her youngest.
It was very difficult for my youngest son to come home every night and not have his brothers there, and go to the same school and not see his brothers.
Brooklyn suggests to Paul that they move to Boston.
By this stage, he was working for himself as a builder, and he had various projects underway. He said, okay, great, we'll buy houses, renovate them and flip them and start a new life.
Brooklyn and Mac head to Boston in April of 2014.
I was still devastated about my sons, but it was easier to try and move forward when I wasn't faced with the same things every day that reminded me of them. So Mac and I are in Boston. He was happy, I was happy, and we were expecting that Paul would join us within 2, maybe 3 months. Then suddenly the communication starts to dwindle and he's not calling every day. He didn't contact me for my birthday. It didn't take long for me to question him about what was going on. So he says to me, I would finish these jobs a lot quicker if you can fund them, and then once I finish them, I'll get the final payment and then I'll repay you.
Brooklyn knows that lending money to Paul is a risk, but after 11 years of marriage, she doesn't want to give up on him.
I don't like quitters, and I don't like to quit on things myself. I'm going to stick with something until the very end. So I went ahead and gave him the money.
It won't be long before Brooklyn discovers the real purpose of the money.
It was the middle of the night, and I was woken up by Mac, who was then 8 years old, who had his iPad in his hand. So he hands me his iPad and says, "Who is this lady in the picture with Dad?" Somebody had sent him a Facebook notification. Hang on, is this an old picture of Paul? This is my husband, but I've got no idea who this woman is. Paul's wearing a black tie suit, and this blonde woman is wearing what looks like a ball gown. I had no idea when the photo was taken, who this woman was, what Paul was doing there, or what the event was. I felt sick. I felt like my whole life was spinning out of control.
Brooklyn Carter is mortified to discover pictures of her husband in the very close company of another woman.
I'm realizing that this is not an old photo from some time before my time with Paul. This is something that's going on now that shouldn't be going on.
It doesn't take long to figure out that the event is an engagement party, and the lady in red is Paul's new fiancée.
Catherine Dubois was a Melbourne woman. She was a bit of a socialite, had great friends, but love was missing, and so she went online to find that. Catherine met Paul on Tinder. Paul rocked up to that date driving a Maserati and claimed he owned a big fleet of them. He claimed to be a self-made millionaire with this big property empire across Melbourne and Queensland.
The courtship begins after Brooklyn leaves for Boston.
Catherine said it was something of a whirlwind romance. He was extremely kind, he paid a lot of attention to her, and came across as extremely committed. She decided to move in with him, and to her shock, he lived in this basic townhouse in Box Hill, which is certainly not where you'd think a multimillionaire lives. Paul had an explanation, and that was that this was a temporary place that he was living while he and his ex-partner had been building this dream home. He actually told her his ex-wife had passed away with brain cancer, so she stopped asking questions. It was about 12 weeks into their love story. Paul got down on one knee and asked Catherine to marry him, and it was an easy yes for her. Catherine owned a beauty bar just outside of Melbourne, and it was to be acquired by the government to make way for a major road project. Catherine said that Paul really convinced her that he was something of an acquisitions expert, and so she was quick to transfer him power of attorney.
With Brooklyn conveniently tucked away in Boston, Paul Carter feels confident that he's safe to openly celebrate his new love. But he fails to consider the massive reach of social media.
After several months of me questioning whether he was having an affair or he was becoming more and more distant, I finally had the proof. So I called him and I said to him, "What the hell is this? What is going on?" He said that he would come over to Boston, and in the meantime we were doing counselling over the phone and trying to figure out if this was at all salvageable.
In Australia, Catherine Dubois receives a very similar shock.
After Catherine and Paul's engagement party, she receives a call from somebody who knows Paul. And they tell her, he has a wife and child in the US. You need to end this. Catherine now believes that he was trying to take over the beauty salon that she'd transferred into his name.
Paul and Catherine break off their relationship, and in November 2014, Paul heads off to Boston and attempts to patch up his relationship with Brooklyn.
He was able to convince me that he was remorseful for what he had done. I'd already been through a divorce and lost my kids. I wasn't going to risk doing that again and losing my youngest son. So I was going to do whatever I had to do to make it work. I still felt like I could pull out the defibrillator once again and restart the heart and try and get things back on track.
On a romantic trip to New York City for Brooklyn's 46th birthday, Paul tells her he wants to renew his commitment to her.
We had a lovely weekend in New York City, and he had organised with a jeweller to look at some diamonds because he was going to get a ring made for me.
But within weeks, it becomes clear she'll never get that diamond ring.
The money hasn't been transferred to the jeweller. No money has come into our accounts. I had faced about as much humiliation as I could take at this point. I was really losing faith in Paul. But I want to be able to say to my kids that I gave it my best shot. I didn't just quit because it got too hard. I just wasn't prepared to lose all that money and then find out a couple of weeks later that he inherited tens of millions of dollars from his grandmother.
Paul has one more gambit to keep Brooklyn happy.
Early 2018, we took over a lease on a horse farm that we were to purchase. We had scheduled the closing to coincide with plenty of time for the money to come from overseas.
Paul spent many years convincing Brooklyn that he was to inherit, and every time this deal was due to close, there was always an excuse as to why it wasn't happening. He would go to extreme lengths to keep up the con. fake contracts written in Italian would be delivered to her door, and another time that she'd receive calls from a fake number explaining to her why this was being delayed.
With the final payment on the farm looming, Brooklyn puts pressure on Paul for some financial relief. And this turns into his breaking point.
Paul came home and said, there's no inheritance. There isn't any money coming, there's no money. I slid down the fridge and onto the floor like a cartoon character. The whole game was up.
Furious and deeply betrayed, Brooklyn kicks Paul out.
I was now left with this farm that I had to pay for. I enlisted the support of my dad to help figure out the financial part of it until I was able to sell my house and repay him. Fortunately for me, my father made me sign a prenup with Paul, so I didn't end up having to split our assets. Finally, I had control of my life back again from Paul Carter. Or so I thought.
Paul, cut off from his slush fund, is angry and desperate.
Paul shows up to the farm. He was really angry. And he says to me, I'm going to kill myself, but I'm going to make sure I take you down with me. And I just felt chills go down my spine.
Brooklyn Carter is finally coming clean with herself about who her husband really is. And she's terrified.
He was not in control of money, property, our child, nothing. The gravy train had well and truly stopped, and it just enraged him. I went out and bought myself a rifle. My son was sleeping with a baseball bat next to his bed. I was terrified of what might happen.
Brooklyn gets a restraining order, and then finally, after 16 years of marriage, she files for divorce.
I couldn't lose any more money, I couldn't lose any more sleep, I couldn't be any more miserable. I thought, if I don't do something now, I'm not even going to have the energy to get out of this marriage.
In August 2019, the divorce becomes final, and Brooklyn gets full custody of Mac.
I couldn't hold back my emotion, and I burst into tears, and my head fell onto the desk in the courtroom.
But there is just one problem.
I became increasingly concerned about being on the same visa as Paul Carter. I decided I needed to get Mac and I a new visa. My very close friend suggested that we get married because we both had no intentions of ever remarrying in our lives.
Brooklyn and her female friend hold a garden wedding in Albany in September 2019.
She was going to come and live at the house that I had built at my farm, and we were just going to grow old together and help each other out and be companions for each other.
Before the couple can even move in together, Brooklyn's life takes an unforeseen turn.
I get a call from 60 Minutes Australia.
He may look like an ordinary bloke, but this is one of Australia's most cunning con men, a ruthless operator who's fleeced millions from family, friends, the rich and the poor.
60 Minutes seemed to have even more information about things that he had done that I had no clue about.
We gave him the moniker the Casanova con man because his biggest cons were of women he made believe that he loved them.
Paul Carter.
They tracked him down at a job site, which was a very rewarding moment to see because they made him come down off the roof and it was just perfect.
Why would you tell Catherine that your partner had died of bone
Yeah, that was
cancer?
a mistake. I was going through a bad time with my then wife and it was just a mistake.
They knew about the Uniting Church fiasco and they just had facts and figures and numbers on different projects that he was doing. He hadn't had time to prepare any answers, but he still denied everything.
So I keep hearing this, but I don't know who you're talking about.
He's just deny.
What about the Italian inheritance that didn't exist?
There isn't one.
Was that another mistake?
Yeah, it was, yeah.
After the expose, Paul Carter becomes the subject of a Homeland Security investigation.
He had engaged in these fraud schemes for many years with almost no law enforcement intervention. We were able to determine that he had used multiple identities. At that time, his most recent name is Paul Hamilton. We execute a search warrant at his residence. We found a law diploma under the name of Paul Hamilton. We found a document that was fraudulent from the Department of Homeland Security indicating that he had been awarded United States citizenship. We found military uniforms in his closet. We found a document indicating that he was the beneficiary of over $30 million in trust funds. All of these items were in line with what the underlying allegations were about him. We immediately arrested Paul Carter. So we took him into custody on the felony charges of visa fraud and false statements.
This should have been the end of Brooklyn's nightmare with Paul, except that her marriage to him has put her under the microscope of Homeland Security as well.
A couple of months later, it was about 9:30 or 10 o'clock in the morning, and there's a knock on the door. Brooklyn, we need you to open the door. It's Homeland Security.
The execution of the search warrant at Brooklyn's house was specifically in regard to the allegations of marriage fraud against her.
They're bashing on the door. Open the door, Brooklyn. So I opened the door, and 8 agents in bulletproof vests with guns stormed through my door and up the stairs. They took all our cell phones and computers, took my son's gaming computer, everything that they could get their hands on, and sent it to Quantico to get analysed.
Brooklyn is suspected of committing marriage fraud with her wife in order to gain a green card.
I was not prepared to drag her or her family through the mud with the government. This was supposed to be a happy situation for both of us.
Brooklyn divorces her wife in June 2020.
They never charged me with marriage fraud, but it was enough for them to then look at the ESTA form that I'd filled in and decide, oh, well, that's not right either. There was a felony charge for filling in the ESTA while I was still in the United States.
Brooklyn Carter ultimately pled guilty to making false statements on the ESTA application, which is utilized to re-enter the United States at some point.
Paul Carter also faces his day of reckoning in a federal court, and despite the many allegations, he too is charged with visa fraud on April 7th, 2021, and held in an Albany jail.
Paul Carter was sentenced to time served and a $5,000 fine. We were not, as an agency, pleased with the sentence, but he's now a convicted felon, which in part is based on the work that our agency and our office did.
His deportation hearing has been delayed, and now he has moved to the other side of the country and applied for a green card. So it seems that he's bought himself another couple of years of stalling techniques.
I think based on his history, it's likely that he'll come back around. I'd be surprised if we haven't heard the last of Paul Carter.
Meanwhile, because of Brooklyn's conviction, she must leave the United States. A huge disappointment, but there is a silver lining. A man named Sean Donahue.
I heard that she had to leave the country, and I said, I'm going to marry you, and I'm going to get your son away from Paul. And if he'll have me and you'll allow it, I'm going to adopt him and make him a Donahue.
I can't overstate how wonderful he has been to Mac and I. He's the happy ending that we deserve. I've brought chaos to this man's life, and he's still there standing right beside me. And I believe he will be till our dying days.
We're happy as can be now. We are not going to let anybody shatter our marriage. And I'll be with Brooklyn as soon as I can in another country at the soonest available time.
I've been dragged through the gates of hell to get to the happy ending. I've come out the other end. It's going to make a good story for my grandchildren, that's for sure.
The South Pacific has long been romanticized in the Western consciousness as a sanctuary of absolute tranquility, a place where the horizon stretches indefinitely and the complexities of modern civilization are washed away by the rhythmic cresting of the tide. When outsiders think of American Samoa, and specifically of its main volcanic island, Tutuila, they visualize a landscape dominated by jagged, emerald peaks that plunge dramatically into the azure depths of the ocean. They imagine a communal sanctuary preserved in time, where ancient traditions provide a harmonious framework for daily existence. But for those who inhabit the geographic reality of a small, isolated landmass, the ocean is not merely a scenic vista, it is a boundary. It is an immutable perimeter that defines the limits of one's physical world. In 1981, this remote territory became the crucible for a legal and psychological tragedy that shattered the idyllic illusion of the island, exposing a dark, claustrophobic undercurrent that lay beneath the surface of its highly structured society. It was a year when the delicate equilibrium between ancient communal obligations and individual psychological endurance completely collapsed, leaving 2 innocent people dead and a community grappling with an entirely unprecedented form of horror. To understand the events that transpired in 1981, one must first confront the profound silence that often follows an act of extreme, inexplicable violence. In most traditional homicide investigations, detectives begin their work by pulling at the visible threads of human friction. They look for the familiar, destructive catalysts that have driven humanity to violence since the dawn of time: avarice, sexual jealousy, long-standing familial feuds, or sudden, drug-fueled escalations. When a life is violently taken, there is almost always a trail of breadcrumbs left behind by the perpetrator's malice or desperation. But when the authorities on Tutuila Island were called to the scene of a brutal double homicide that year, they found themselves staring into a void. The crime scene was characterized by an overwhelming, excessive degree of physical brutality, suggesting a state of total, unbridled frenzy. Yet, when investigators began the arduous process of tracing the relationship between the killer and the deceased, they discovered absolutely nothing. There were no hidden financial grievances, no historical animosities, and no verbal altercations leading up to the assault. The victims had done nothing to provoke their fate. They were simply present when an invisible, psychological dam finally broke. The man who wielded the violence was Viliamu Satel. Prior to that fateful day, he was a man whose existence was defined by the same rigid expectations that governed every other male member of his community. He was a participant in a society where individuality is routinely subordinated to the collective will of the clan, and where personal identity is inextricably bound to one's position within a complex, ancestral hierarchy. But underneath the outward appearance of compliance, a catastrophic neurological and psychological failure was quietly developing. The tragedy of Viliamu Satel is not a conventional story of a predatory criminal calculating a wicked deed for personal gain. Instead, it is a deeply unsettling exploration of what happens when a severe, undiagnosed physical vulnerability of the brain is placed under the unrelenting, high-pressure hydraulic press of rigid cultural expectations and geographic confinement. It is a case that forced the American legal system to expand its understanding of human accountability, pushing the boundaries of forensic psychiatry into the complex terrain of anthropological trauma. When the first responders arrived at the scene of the crime, the atmosphere on the island changed instantly. The immediate shockwave of the double murder reverberated through every village, traveling quickly across the narrow coastal roads and through the valleys of Tutuila. In a small society where everyone is connected by blood, marriage, or ancient tribal allegiances, a violent act committed by one of their own against another is not merely a violation of statutory law. It is a profound rupture in the sacred fabric of the community. The sheer scale of the violence utilized by Sattel indicated that this was not a momentary lapse in judgment, but an absolute abdication of human reason. The physical evidence spoke of an individual who had completely lost contact with reality, transforming into a vessel of pure, chaotic destruction. The immediate question that consumed the islanders and the colonial authorities was not who had committed this atrocity, for Sattel's involvement was undeniable, but rather, what could possibly possess a man to execute such an extreme level of savagery against individuals with whom he had no meaningful conflict? As the legal machinery of American Samoa began to turn, moving Sattel from the custody of local jailers toward a formal trial for 2 counts of first-degree murder, the case quickly outgrew the parameters of a standard criminal prosecution. The courtroom would not merely become a place to establish the physical facts of the assault, which were already undisputed. Instead, it would transform into an intellectual battleground where the human mind itself was put on trial. A team of dedicated forensic psychiatrists, neurologists, and legal experts was assembled to look into the history of Viliama Sattel, peeling back the layers of his life to discover how a human being could be driven to such a state of absolute cognitive fragmentation. What they uncovered would challenge the very foundations of how the law defines sanity, intent, and criminal responsibility within an indigenous context governed by Western legal statutes. The defense would ultimately present a thesis that seemed entirely radical at the time, that Viliama Sattel's brain was a fragile, compromised organ that had been systematically eroded by a unique combination of organic physical damage and an oppressive, unyielding environment. They argued that the killer was, in his own tragic way, a casualty of an invisible war raging between his internal neurological deficits and the external, crushing weight of his society. The experts pointed to 2 primary, interconnected forces that had acted as the ultimate catalysts for his psychic break. The first was the Matai system, the ancient, deeply entrenched traditional social structure that demands absolute, unquestioning obedience and places immense, unceasing financial and moral burdens on the individual for the sake of the collective clan honor. The second was a phenomenon known informally as island confinement, the profound, suffocating sense of entrapment that can overwhelm an individual when they are trapped within a microscopic geographic space, surrounded by an unforgiving ocean, with no possibility of escape from the perpetual scrutiny of their peers and elders. This podcast series is an invitation to step away from simplistic moral dichotomies and examine the terrifying space where biology, culture, and geography collide. Over the course of this narrative, we will meticulously reconstruct the life of Viliama Sattel, the societal structures that shaped his reality, the sudden explosion of violence that claimed 2 innocent lives, and the landmark legal battle that followed. We will look at how the defense successfully argued that the environment of Tutuila Island was itself a psychological weapon, one that continuously compressed Sattel's fragile mental state like a tightly wound spring until it finally snapped with lethal force. It is a story that requires us to maintain a profound sense of empathy for the innocent victims whose lives were so brutally cut short, while simultaneously confronting the deeply uncomfortable truth that the structures designed to keep a society together can, under the right circumstances, completely destroy the human mind. As we look deeper into the historical records of 1981, we must prepare ourselves to listen to testimony that describes a type of madness that is both deeply personal and profoundly cultural. We will witness how a man was declared not guilty by reason of insanity, not because he lacked a basic moral compass, but because his brain had been rendered entirely incapable of processing the immense, multi-layered demands of his world. And we will examine the extraordinary, unprecedented conclusion of this case, where the legal system determined that the only way to ensure public safety and preserve the sanity of the accused was to permanently sever him from his homeland, casting him out into the vast, anonymous urban landscape of Los Angeles, California. This is the story of Viliama Sattel, a case where the island itself became both the incubator of a monstrous act and the ultimate justification for a historic verdict. To comprehend the sheer magnitude of the tragedy that unfolded in 1981, one must first look deeply into the environment that served as its stage. The island of Tutuila, the primary landmass of American Samoa, is a place of profound and striking natural beauty, characterized by steep volcanic mountains that drop precipitously into the warm waters of the South Pacific Ocean. To the casual observer or the passing traveler, this isolated territory appears as an absolute paradise, a vibrant green jewel surrounded by an endless expanse of blue. The air is thick with the scent of tropical flora and the rhythmic sound of the surf breaking against the coral reefs. However, beneath this picturesque exterior lies a complex and highly demanding social reality. Tutuila is not merely a geographic location, it is an enclosed ecosystem, both physically and culturally. It is a place where space is severely limited, where the same roads are traveled every single day, and where the vast ocean acts not just as a scenic backdrop, but as a formidable, impassable wall for those who do not have the means to leave. This physical isolation breeds a specific kind of psychological environment, one that forces extreme social cohesion while simultaneously eliminating the concept of personal anonymity. In a sprawling mainland city, an individual can easily fade into the background, escaping the scrutiny of their neighbors and reinventing themselves whenever the burden of their current life becomes too heavy to bear. On Tutuila, fading away is a geographical and social impossibility. Every face is familiar, every family lineage is known, and every action is observed by the collective eyes of the community. For the vast majority of the inhabitants, this tight-knit structure provides a profound sense of belonging, a lifelong safety net where one is never truly alone. But for a mind that is already fracturing, this inescapable closeness can quickly transform a tropical haven into a suffocating, invisible prison. The true weight of this environment cannot be understood without examining the foundational pillar of Samoan society, the traditional governance structure known as the Matai system. This ancient and deeply entrenched system dictates almost every facet of existence on the island, operating alongside and often superseding the formal Western legal framework. In this cultural paradigm, the extended family network is the ultimate unit of society, and at the head of every family stands the Matai, the chief. The Matai holds absolute authority over communal lands, familial wealth, and the social standing of the clan. Living within this system requires a level of submission that is difficult for modern, individualistic societies to fully grasp. An individual is taught from birth that their personal desires, their financial independence, and even their personal grievances must always be subordinated to the needs and the honor of the collective family. Obedience to the Matai is not a suggestion. It is a rigid, non-negotiable requirement. This obedience carries with it massive responsibilities. Family members are expected to contribute heavily to communal events, from weddings and funerals to church obligations and village ceremonies. These financial and labor contributions are a matter of intense pride and severe social pressure. Failing to meet these obligations does not merely result in personal embarrassment, it brings profound, lasting shame upon the entire extended family, a disgrace that is remembered and spoken about by the rest of the village. The burden of maintaining the family honor rests heavily on the shoulders of every man and woman, creating a continuous, lifelong cycle of obligation, labor, and financial strain. There is no opting out of this system while remaining on the island. To reject the authority of the Matai is to sever oneself from one's identity, one's land, and one's support network, resulting in complete social exile. Therefore, the people of Tutuila carry an invisible, staggering weight every single day, balancing the demands of their own survival with the unending requirements of their ancestral bloodlines. When you combine the inescapable physical boundaries of a small island with the unrelenting, high-pressure demands of the Matai system, you create a unique sociological phenomenon that psychologists refer to as island confinement syndrome. It is a form of chronic, low-grade psychological compression. The individual is trapped between the vast ocean that prevents physical escape and the rigid cultural hierarchy that prevents social escape. For individuals possessing a standard level of psychological resilience, this environment is manageable through community support, shared cultural values, and the deep bonds of familial love. They learn to navigate the pressures, finding joy and purpose within the strict parameters of their society. However, When an individual possesses underlying psychiatric vulnerabilities or organic cognitive deficits, this specific environment becomes extraordinarily dangerous. The vulnerable mind, lacking the necessary coping mechanisms and emotional elasticity, absorbs the communal pressure not as a shared responsibility, but as an overwhelming, direct assault on its own stability. The constant observation by the community feels like a relentless interrogation. The financial and social obligations imposed by the Matai system feel like a tightening physical grip around the throat. Because there is nowhere to hide on the island and no acceptable way to vocalize a rebellion against the deeply respected cultural traditions, the internal pressure simply builds. It accumulates year after year, layering stress upon stress, frustration upon frustration, in a mind that is biologically incapable of processing it. The individual becomes a human pressure cooker, absorbing the immense weight of their society while desperately trying to maintain a facade of compliance. In the case of Viliama Satel, the internal neurological damage he suffered robbed him of the very mental tools required to survive this specific environment, transforming the island of Tutuila from his ancestral home into a psychological torture chamber that systematically dismantled his sanity. It was within this intense, inescapable crucible that 2 innocent lives were abruptly and violently extinguished in 1981. To fully respect the gravity of this tragedy, we must turn our attention away from the man who committed the violence and focus on the victims whose futures were so brutally stolen. These were ordinary members of the Tutuila community, individuals who woke up that fateful morning with no premonition that their lives were about to intersect with a catastrophic psychological collapse. They were deeply woven into the fabric of the island, actively participating in the very same cultural systems that governed everyone else. They had families who relied on them, elders whom they respected, and communal obligations they were diligently fulfilling. Their daily routines were dictated by the familiar, peaceful rhythms of island life, from the early morning chores to the evening gatherings with extended relatives. They were entirely blameless in the events that ultimately caused their demise. The most horrifying aspect of their deaths was the absolute randomness of their selection. They did not harbor any secret animosity toward Viliama Satel. There were no underlying financial disputes, no unresolved land arguments, and no history of bad blood between their respective families. In a society where conflicts are usually highly visible and intimately tied to clan politics, the complete absence of a motive made their murders all the more terrifying. These 2 individuals were simply going about their normal day, existing in the wrong physical space at the exact moment that Satel's fragile internal dam finally gave way. When the crushing weight of the island confinement and the unrelenting pressure of his social obligations shattered his compromised brain, he did not seek out specific enemies. He lashed out blindly, a vessel of pure, undirected rage, destroying the very first people who happened to cross his path. The sheer brutality inflicted upon them was not a reflection of any hatred he held for them personally. Rather, it was a terrifying manifestation of the massive, accumulated psychological agony he had been harboring for years. The victims bore the physical brunt of an invisible, cultural weight that Satel could no longer carry. In an instant, their lives were erased, leaving behind families who were violently thrust into a nightmare of unimaginable grief. The sudden loss of these 2 community members sent a shockwave of profound sorrow throughout the tight-knit island. Relatives were left to mourn not just the absence of their loved ones, but the incomprehensible nature of their passing. Funerals were arranged under the heavy, somber traditions of the Matai system, with the entire village gathering to mourn, completely bewildered by the senselessness of the violence. The community was forced to bury 2 of their own, wrestling with the terrifying realization that the danger had not come from an outside invader or a known, malicious criminal, but from a neighbor whose mind had quietly disintegrated right beside them. The victims became the tragic, involuntary collateral damage of a perfect psychological storm, a devastating collision between a damaged human brain and the overwhelming forces of geographical isolation and unyielding cultural demands. Their memories serve as a haunting reminder of the unpredictable fragility of the human condition and the terrible price that innocent people sometimes pay when the invisible structures of a society push a vulnerable mind past the ultimate point of no return. As the sun set on Tutuila that day, casting long, dark shadows over the volcanic peaks and the tranquil ocean, the island was irrevocably changed. The illusion of safety within the structured confines of their ancient traditions had been violently shattered. The community was left staring into a terrifying abyss, struggling to understand how their sacred way of life, designed to foster unity and collective strength, could have somehow contributed to the creation of a monster. The blood of the two innocent victims stained the soil of their ancestral land, demanding answers that traditional wisdom could not provide. The tragedy demanded an investigation that would have to look far beyond the physical evidence of the crime scene. It would require investigators, psychiatrists, and legal scholars to delve deep into the unseen, oppressive forces that govern daily life on the island, forcing a painful re-examination of the very environment they called home. The story of these two victims is the heartbreaking foundation upon which the entire legal and psychological battle of Villiamasatel was built, a battle that would ultimately challenge everything the world understood about crime, culture, and the absolute limits of human sanity. The year 1981 began on the island of Tutuila much like any other year in the modern history of American Samoa, characterized by the predictable, comforting rhythms of a community deeply rooted in its ancestral traditions and the natural cycles of the South Pacific. The days were measured not merely by the hands of a clock, but by the shifting of the tides, the position of the equatorial sun, and the unending sequence of communal obligations dictated by the rigid social hierarchy. On the surface, the island projected an aura of absolute serenity, a tropical sanctuary where the dense, emerald foliage of the volcanic mountains sloped gracefully down to meet the pristine waters of the ocean. The air was perpetually thick with a heavy, tropical humidity, carrying the familiar sense of blooming hibiscus, roasting breadfruit, and the salty breeze sweeping in from the vast expanse of the sea. For the inhabitants of this isolated territory, life was an intricate tapestry woven from the threads of intense familial devotion, strict religious observance, and unquestioning adherence to the ancient cultural framework that governed their every interaction. It was an environment that demanded conformity and offered collective security in return, a place where extreme acts of random, unprovoked violence were virtually unheard of, relegated to the chaotic, distant shores of the mainland United States. The societal structure was designed to mediate disputes through the authority of the village elders and the extended family networks, ensuring that personal grievances rarely escalated beyond controlled, localized tensions. However, this illusion of perpetual harmony was destined to be irrevocably shattered on a day that would forever alter the psychological landscape of the island, a day when the invisible, crushing weight of societal pressure finally breached the fragile confines of a damaged human mind, resulting in an explosion of violence so extreme and so entirely devoid of logic that it would leave the entire territory in a state of profound, paralyzed shock. The two victims of this unprecedented tragedy awoke on that fateful morning completely unaware that they were living the final hours of their lives. They were ordinary individuals, deeply embedded in the fabric of their local village, whose daily routines reflected the peaceful, industrious nature of their community. Their identities were defined by their roles within their respective families, their contributions to the collective welfare, and their adherence to the expectations placed upon them by their elders. On this particular day, their activities were entirely mundane, devoid of any significant conflict or unusual tension. They were simply occupying their designated space within the world, engaging in the normal, necessary tasks that sustained their households and fulfilled their communal duties. They harbored no ill will toward anyone, and they had absolutely no reason to suspect that danger was lurking within the familiar boundaries of their village. They were not involved in any illicit activities, they were not entangled in any bitter land disputes, and they had not offended the honor of any rival clans. They were, by all accounts, entirely innocent participants in the daily life of Tutuila, surrounded by people they had known for their entire existence, protected by the unwritten social contracts that had kept their ancestors safe for generations. Their utter lack of culpability makes the sheer randomness of their impending demise all the more terrifying, serving as a brutal reminder that even the most structured and sheltered environments cannot always provide protection against the sudden, catastrophic failure of the human brain. William Sattel did not arrive at the scene of the crime as a calculating predator executing a premeditated plan of destruction. He arrived as a man whose internal reality had completely detached from the physical world around him, a vessel overflowing with an accumulation of psychological agony that his organically damaged brain could no longer contain or process. For years, the profound geographical isolation of the island and the unyielding, oppressive demands of the traditional social hierarchy had acted as a relentless hydraulic press against his fragile cognitive architecture. He was fundamentally incapable of navigating the intense social scrutiny and the heavy financial and moral burdens required of him, yet he was trapped in an environment where escape was geographically impossible and social rebellion was culturally unthinkable. As he moved through the village on that day, the internal pressure reached a critical, irreversible threshold. The invisible spring that had been winding tighter and tighter within his mind finally snapped. There was no specific trigger, no verbal altercation, no inciting incident that would normally precede an act of violence. There was only the sudden, absolute collapse of his inhibitory controls, the catastrophic failure of the neurological mechanisms that separate rational human behavior from primal, unbridled aggression. He was no longer reacting to the external world. He was reacting entirely to the terrifying, chaotic storm raging within his own fractured consciousness, a storm that demanded an immediate, physical release of the unbearable tension that had been slowly destroying him from the inside out. When Sattel encountered the two victims, they were merely geographical coordinates in his path, tragic targets of an undirected, apocalyptic rage. The assault that followed was not merely a murder, it was an act of extreme, overkill violence that defied all rational comprehension. The suddenness of the attack left the victims with absolutely no opportunity to defend themselves, to reason with their attacker, or even to comprehend the nightmare that had suddenly engulfed them. Sattel unleashed a torrent of physical devastation that was described by later observers as completely frenzied and devoid of any human empathy or restraint. He utilized an extreme level of force that went far beyond what was necessary to simply extinguish a human life, suggesting a state of total, animalistic frenzy. The violence was chaotic, rapid, and overwhelmingly brutal, a physical manifestation of a mind that had completely shattered into jagged, uncontrollable pieces. The sheer intensity of the assault transformed the immediate environment from a place of quiet, tropical domesticity into a scene of unimaginable carnage. The physical trauma inflicted upon the victims was so severe that it spoke of an attacker who had lost all connection to his own humanity, a man who was no longer seeing fellow members of his community, but merely objects upon which to vent a cosmic, incomprehensible fury. The extreme nature of the injuries indicated that Sattel was not acting out of a specific desire to punish these individuals, but rather out of a desperate, terrifying need to externalize the chaotic pressure that was tearing his own brain apart. The immediate aftermath of the assault was characterized by a deafening, unnatural silence that seemed to swallow the entire village. The sudden cessation of the violence left a void in the atmosphere, a heavy, suffocating stillness that contrasted sharply with the idyllic beauty of the surrounding landscape. When the first members of the community stumbled upon the scene, they were met with a sight that entirely defied their understanding of the world. The brutalized bodies of the two victims lay amidst the familiar surroundings of their daily lives, a horrific intrusion of absolute chaos into a space normally defined by order and tranquility. The initial reaction of those who discovered the aftermath was not simply sorrow, but a profound, paralyzing psychological shock. The sheer scale of the brutality was entirely alien to their cultural experience, a manifestation of evil that did not fit into any of their established paradigms of human behavior. As the reality of the situation began to permeate the consciousness of the village, a wave of primal fear swept through the community, the terrifying realization that a monster had materialized in their midst without any warning, bringing with him a level of destruction that threatened to unravel the very fabric of their society. The most bewildering and terrifying aspect of the incident quickly became the absolute void of a discernible motive. In the immediate wake of the discovery, as the local authorities and community leaders scrambled to understand what had transpired, they instinctively began searching for the familiar catalysts of violence. They looked for evidence of a long-standing blood feud, a sudden eruption of romantic jealousy, a bitter dispute over ancestral land boundaries, or a catastrophic failure to repay a significant financial debt. They interviewed neighbors, scoured the personal histories of both the victims and the perpetrator, and examined every conceivable social connection that could possibly explain the tragedy. However, their exhaustive efforts yielded absolutely nothing. There was no connection whatsoever between William Sattel and the individuals he had so brutally slaughtered. They had not argued, they had not exchanged insults, and they were not entangled in any form of social or economic conflict. Sattel had simply walked into their presence and unleashed a level of violence that is typically reserved for one's most hated enemy, yet he harbored no personal animosity toward them at all. This complete absence of a rational motive created a terrifying vacuum at the center of the investigation, leaving the authorities completely baffled and the community deeply traumatized. The realization that there was no logical reason for the murders meant that there was no way to predict or prevent such an event from happening again. It meant that the violence was not a response to a specific provocation, but a random, uncontrollable force of nature, a psychological hurricane that had materialized out of nowhere to destroy everything in its path. This lack of a traditional motive fundamentally shifted the trajectory of the entire case. It forced the realization that the answers to this tragedy would not be found in the social interactions of the individuals involved, but rather in the dark, hidden recesses of the perpetrator's mind. The investigators were confronted with a horrific puzzle where the pieces simply did not fit together, a crime scene that screamed of intense, personal hatred but lacked any interpersonal foundation. The sheer brutality of the act, combined with the absolute randomness of the victims, pointed toward a terrifying conclusion that the legal system of American Samoa was entirely unprepared to handle. It suggested that William Sattel was not a criminal in the traditional sense, driven by greed, malice, or revenge, but a man whose biological machinery had catastrophically failed under the invisible, crushing weight of his environment. The horrific events of that day established a gruesome baseline for what would become one of the most complex and unprecedented legal battles in the history of the territory, a battle that would require the brightest minds in forensic psychiatry to decipher the devastating intersection of organic brain damage, geographic confinement, and the unyielding pressures of an ancient cultural system. The incident itself remained a monument to senseless tragedy, a violent rupture in time that claimed 2 innocent lives and forever destroyed the illusion of safety on the beautiful, isolated shores of Tutuila Island, leaving behind a legacy of trauma and a desperate, agonizing search for meaning in the face of absolute, unbridled madness. When the local territorial police arrived at the location of the double homicide, they stepped into a scene that completely defied the standard operational parameters of law enforcement on the island of Tutuila. The officers, accustomed to resolving minor property disputes, petty thefts, and occasional physical altercations fueled by intoxication, found themselves entirely unequipped to process the sheer magnitude of the carnage that lay before them. The physical environment, normally bathed in the serene, golden light of the South Pacific, felt profoundly contaminated by the extreme violence that had just occurred. The forensic documentation process began with a sense of collective disbelief as investigators carefully photographed and cataloged the gruesome evidence left in the wake of William Sattel. Every blood spatter, every overturned piece of furniture, and every defensive wound on the victims told a story of overwhelming, catastrophic physical force. However, as the detectives meticulously processed the physical remnants of the assault, they quickly realized that the scene was entirely devoid of the standard markers of a premeditated crime. There was no evidence of a robbery, as valuables remained untouched in plain sight. There was no indication of a forced entry suggesting a stealthy invasion, nor were there any signs of a localized struggle that might imply a sudden, escalating argument. Instead, the physical evidence pointed uniformly to a spontaneous, unilateral explosion of catastrophic violence. The investigators collected the forensic data with a growing sense of dread, understanding that the physical clues alone would never be sufficient to explain the psychological abyss that had opened up in their community. The blood on the ground confirmed the mechanical reality of the deaths, but it offered absolutely zero insight into the fundamental question of why two completely innocent individuals had been violently erased from existence on a seemingly ordinary afternoon. Determined to impose a rational narrative upon an irrational act, the investigation immediately pivoted toward a desperate, exhaustive search for a traditional motive. In the tightly knit society of American Samoa, where privacy is virtually non-existent and the intricate webs of social relationships are known to everyone, secrets are incredibly difficult to maintain. Detectives fanned out across the village and the surrounding districts, initiating a relentless series of interviews with the families of the victims, the local Matai chiefs, neighbors, and extended relatives. They were searching for any hidden friction that could have possibly ignited such a disproportionate, lethal response. The investigators systematically explored every conceivable avenue of human conflict. They scrutinized the financial records of both the perpetrator and the deceased, looking for unpaid debts, stolen property, or disputes over communal funds. They delved deep into the complex history of ancestral land boundaries, a frequent source of generational tension within the Matai system, hoping to find a territorial grievance that had quietly festered into murderous rage. They even probed the most intimate aspects of the individuals involved, searching for rumors of romantic entanglements, hidden jealousies, or perceived insults to family honor. Yet, as the days progressed and the interview files grew thicker, the detectives were met with an impenetrable wall of confusion and denial. Witness after witness confirmed the same baffling reality that Viliama Satel and his victims existed in entirely separate social orbits, possessing no meaningful relationship, no history of animosity, and absolutely no reason to harbor ill will toward one another. The thorough background checks revealed that the victims were universally respected, peaceable members of their clan, while Satel himself had no prior history of violent criminality that would suggest a predisposition to such an atrocity. The complete evaporation of any logical motive left the investigative team stranded in a state of profound professional paralysis. They had a confessed killer in custody, a pristine chain of physical evidence, and two bodies, but they lacked the essential narrative tissue that connects a perpetrator to their crime. The absence of a motive transformed the investigation from a straightforward procedural task into a terrifying existential mystery, suggesting that the violence was not a product of human malice, but of something far more incomprehensible. As the external investigation hit a brick wall, the attention of the authorities turned inward, focusing entirely on the behavioral evidence exhibited by Viliama Satel as he sat in police custody. In the aftermath of a typical homicide, a perpetrator will almost always display behavioral markers that align with a functioning, albeit criminal, human psyche. They might exhibit profound remorse, frantically attempting to justify their actions through tears and apologies. Alternatively, they might display cold, calculating defiance, constructing elaborate alibis, or aggressively deflecting blame onto the victims. Some perpetrators succumb to the crushing weight of their guilt, while others revel in the notoriety of their actions. Satel, however, displayed absolutely none of these standard psychological responses. From the moment he was apprehended, his demeanor was characterized by a chilling, hollow detachment that deeply unnerved the seasoned officers tasked with observing him. He did not attempt to minimize the brutality of his actions, nor did he offer any rationalization for the slaughter. He sat in his holding cell enveloped in an eerie, flat effect, staring blankly ahead as if he were an empty vessel entirely disconnected from the horrific reality he had just created. When questioned by detectives, his responses were not evasive or deceptive, but rather disjointed and profoundly detached from the emotional gravity of the situation. It became increasingly apparent to the investigators that they were not interrogating a man who was hiding the truth, but rather a man who had completely lost the capacity to comprehend the truth. He lacked the fundamental cognitive architecture required to process guilt, consequence, or moral accountability. His behavior strongly suggested that the violence he had unleashed was not a conscious choice, but an involuntary biological imperative, a catastrophic malfunction of his own nervous system. The officers noted his erratic thought patterns, his inability to track linear conversations, and the bizarre, vacant nature of his gaze. This collection of behavioral evidence served as a crucial turning point in the case, forcing the authorities to realize that applying standard criminal interrogation techniques to Sattel was an exercise in futility. The man in their custody was physically present, but his mind had already fractured into 1,000 unrecognizable pieces, scattered by an invisible storm that the police were entirely unequipped to measure. This profound realization necessitated a fundamental paradigm shift in the trajectory of the investigation. The local prosecutors and investigative chiefs recognized that the pursuit of a traditional criminal conviction based on premeditated intent was rapidly becoming legally and ethically untenable. To simply label Sattel a malicious murderer would be to ignore the glaring, terrifying reality of his shattered mental state. The decision was made to halt the aggressive search for a hidden motive and instead initiate an intensive, comprehensive neuropsychological evaluation of the suspect. The authorities transitioned the case from a standard homicide investigation into an unprecedented medical inquiry, reaching beyond the resources of the local police force to enlist the expertise of specialized forensic psychiatrists and neurologists. The focus of the inquiry shifted dramatically. The central question was no longer why Viliamu Sattel chose to kill, but rather what specific sequence of biological and environmental failures had destroyed his ability to choose altogether. This transition marked a historic moment in the legal history of the territory, acknowledging that the mechanisms of justice could not proceed without first understanding the exact nature of the cognitive collapse that had occurred. The investigators effectively handed the suspect over to the medical professionals, asking them to map the invisible contours of Sattel's mind and identify the specific breaking points that had transformed a compliant member of the community into a horrific instrument of death. As the medical experts began their exhaustive examinations, utilizing advanced diagnostic tools and conducting deep, clinical interviews, the true complexity of the case finally began to emerge from the shadows. The investigation had evolved from a search for physical clues at a bloody crime scene into an exploration of the microscopic pathways of the human brain. The detectives stepped back, allowing the psychiatrists to probe the deep-seated neurological deficits and the chronic, invisible stress fractures caused by the oppressive environment of the island. The gathered behavioral evidence, the complete lack of motive, and the brutal, frenzied nature of the attack all pointed toward a single, terrifying hypothesis that the defense would soon bring to the forefront of the impending trial. The investigators had successfully secured the identities of all involved, the geographical coordinates of the tragedy, and the precise timeline of the devastation, but the ultimate answer to the underlying cause was locked away inside the damaged organic tissue of Sattel's brain. The stage was now meticulously set for a legal battle that would bypass standard criminal statutes and delve directly into the intricate, devastating relationship between cultural pressure, geographic isolation, and biological vulnerability, preparing the community for a courtroom revelation far more disturbing than a simple act of calculated evil. When the doors of the High Court of American Samoa finally opened for the trial of Viliamu Sattel, the atmosphere inside the room was thick with an agonizing, almost suffocating tension. The community of Tutuila had spent the preceding months grappling with the horrific aftermath of the double homicide, their collective grief slowly hardening into a desperate, unyielding demand for traditional justice. The families of the two innocent victims occupied the wooden benches of the gallery, their faces etched with a profound sorrow that demanded a clear explanation for the senseless slaughter that had completely shattered their lives. They had come to witness the prosecution of a monster, expecting a straightforward narrative of human malice, personal guilt, and ultimate legal retribution. Sattel faced 2 primary counts of first-degree murder, charges that typically carried the absolute heaviest penalties available under the territorial legal code. However, as the legal proceedings commenced, it became immediately apparent that this trial would not adhere to the familiar, comforting script of crime and punishment. The defense team, armed with the exhaustive findings of the medical evaluations conducted during the investigative phase, was preparing to mount a case that would fundamentally challenge the courtroom's understanding of human agency and criminal responsibility. They were not going to argue that Sattel was innocent of the physical act of killing, as the forensic evidence was insurmountable and his physical presence at the brutal crime scene was an undeniable fact. Instead, they were preparing to argue that the man sitting quietly at the defense table was practically a passenger within his own failing body, a tragic victim of an invisible, biological catastrophe that completely negated his capacity for criminal intent. The trial was poised to transform from a standard criminal adjudication into a highly complex, unprecedented medical tribunal, forcing the judges and the entire island community to confront the terrifying possibility that the true culprit was not a malicious soul, but a profoundly broken brain operating under an unbearable, culturally sanctioned weight. The cornerstone of the defense strategy relied entirely upon the introduction of highly specialized psychiatric and neurological testimony. One by one, medical experts took the stand, transforming the solemn courtroom into a clinical lecture hall. They presented detailed medical histories and advanced cognitive assessments that painted a devastating, microscopic portrait of Sattel's internal reality. The experts testified with absolute certainty that Sattel suffered from severe organic brain damage, a tangible, physical deterioration of the delicate neurological tissues that govern human behavior and rational thought. They carefully explained to the court that a healthy human brain relies on incredibly complex, interconnected neural pathways to regulate intense emotions, process external stimuli, and, most importantly, control aggressive impulses. In a normal individual, the frontal lobes act as an ever-present internal braking system, constantly evaluating social situations and suppressing primal urges that might lead to inappropriate or violent actions. For William Sattel, this critical neurological braking system was fundamentally and permanently compromised. The organic damage meant that his capacity to self-regulate, to pause and consider the consequences of his actions, was vastly diminished compared to a healthy human being. The psychiatrists emphasized repeatedly that this was not a matter of a poor moral compass, a weak character, or a hidden desire to cause pain, but a physiological malfunction as real and as undeniable as a failing heart or a shattered bone. Because of this severe structural deficit, Sattel was exceptionally vulnerable to sensory overload and emotional dysregulation. When faced with escalating environmental stress, his damaged brain simply could not process the information rationally, defaulting instead to a state of chaotic, explosive survival instincts. The medical professionals meticulously dismantled the prosecution's assumption of premeditation, arguing forcefully that Sattel did not plan the murders because his brain literally lacked the functional architecture required to formulate and execute a rational, forward-looking scheme. The horrific violence was not a conscious choice. It was essentially a catastrophic biological misfire, an involuntary spasm of a broken neurological machine. However, organic brain damage alone was not sufficient to explain why the horrific violence erupted on that specific day, nor did it fully explain the unprecedented scale of the brutality. To provide a complete, comprehensive picture of the psychological collapse, the defense team guided the medical experts into the most controversial and profoundly sensitive aspect of their testimony. They began to dissect the ancient cultural environment of American Samoa, explicitly linking Sattel's internal biological fragility to the external, crushing forces of the Matai system. This legal strategy required an immense amount of courage, as it essentially placed the foundational, revered traditions of the island society under a cold, clinical microscope. The experts detailed how the traditional social structure, with its absolute demand for unquestioning obedience to the clan chiefs, created a persistent, low-grade psychological trauma for an individual entirely incapable of meeting its complex demands. They explained that a man with Sattel's severe cognitive deficits was entirely unequipped to navigate the high-stakes social maneuvering and the rigid expectations required by the ancestral hierarchy. The unending financial obligations, the mandatory labor contributions to village ceremonies, and the heavy, continuous burden of carrying the collective honor of the extended family acted as a continuous, unrelenting hydraulic press upon his fractured psyche. In a modern, Western setting, a person with such extreme mental limitations might be placed in a specialized care facility or granted social disability support, effectively removing them from the competitive pressures of daily life. But within the rigid framework of the Matai system, there were absolutely no such exemptions available. Sattel was expected to perform, to contribute, and to submit, just like any other healthy man on the island. The experts argued passionately that this chronic, inescapable expectation placed an agonizing burden on a brain that was already struggling immensely just to maintain a basic grip on reality. This intense cultural pressure was then exponentially magnified by the physical reality of the environment, a phenomenon the psychological experts referred to during their testimony as island confinement. The defense illuminated the profound, suffocating claustrophobia that defines life on Tutuila for someone suffering from extreme mental instability. They painted a vivid picture of a man trapped in a microscopic world where the dense, emerald volcanic mountains and the vast, impassable blue expanse of the Pacific Ocean served as the immutable walls of an invisible, tropical prison. Sattel could not simply walk away from his grueling obligations. He could not move to a neighboring town to start over, nor could he retreat into the blessed anonymity of a bustling metropolis. Everywhere he went, he was instantly recognized. Every single interaction was monitored, judged, and recorded by the collective gaze of his deeply interconnected community. The psychiatrists concluded their testimony with a powerful, defining assertion that would echo through the annals of legal history. They stated clearly that the psychological pressure exerted by the rigid traditional hierarchy, combined with the crushing, inescapable obligations to his tribe and the suffocating feeling of being trapped indefinitely on an isolated landmass, completely and utterly shattered whatever fragile remnants of reason Sattel still possessed. The environment itself was the ultimate catalyst for the murder. The island and its ancient customs had acted as a tightly wound spring, compressing his damaged mind day after day, year after year, until the biological structure finally failed entirely, resulting in the terrifying, indiscriminate explosion of violence that claimed 2 innocent lives on that fateful afternoon. This highly clinical testimony fundamentally altered the entire narrative of the trial, suggesting that the tragedy was not born of inherent evil, but of a catastrophic incompatibility between a broken man and a highly demanding culture. The immense weight of the medical testimony placed the court in an extraordinarily difficult and unprecedented position. The judges were forced to balance the immense, heartbreaking grief of the victims' families against the undeniable, scientifically verified reality of the defendant's shattered mental state. Delivering a verdict in a case that had so deeply traumatized a small, interconnected community required navigating a treacherous path between the local demands for traditional retribution and the modern legal principles of psychiatric accountability. Ultimately, the overwhelming medical consensus presented by the experts simply could not be ignored by the bench. Based on the conclusive, irrefutable evidence of organic brain damage and the profound, psychosis-inducing environmental triggers, the court delivered a landmark ruling. William Sattel was officially declared not guilty by reason of insanity. The solemn pronouncement sent a massive wave of shock and disbelief rippling through the crowded gallery. To the grieving families, the verdict felt like a devastating denial of justice, an incomprehensible legal loophole allowing a brutal killer to escape the executioner or the dark confines of a territorial prison. However, the legal designation of insanity did not equate to immediate freedom. Acknowledging the extreme, ongoing danger Sattel posed to any immediate society, the court ordered him to be immediately transferred off the island and committed directly to the high-security psychiatric ward of the Hawaii State Hospital. He was permanently removed from the general population, destined to spend his days under strict, uncompromising medical supervision in a specialized facility capable of managing his severe deficits. The trial had officially concluded, but the resolution felt incredibly hollow, leaving the community of Tutuila to wrestle painfully with the unsettling reality that their own cherished cultural traditions had been officially cited in a court of law as the primary trigger for a horrific double murder. The strange and unprecedented trajectory of the Viliama Satel case did not end with his quiet commitment to the secure psychiatric facility in Hawaii. Over the course of the following year, as a dedicated team of doctors and therapists worked intensely to stabilize his volatile condition, a profound realization began to take shape among the medical board overseeing his care. Through continuous observation and rigorous psychological treatment, it became abundantly clear that Satel's violent tendencies were inextricably linked to his immediate environment. While the organic brain damage was a permanent, unchangeable fixture of his biology, the explosive, murderous aggression only manifested when he was subjected to the specific, unbearable pressures of his ancestral culture. In 1982, a psychiatric evaluation board reached a startling conclusion that would lead directly to one of the most unusual legal directives in modern judicial history. The experts determined that Satel had finally achieved a baseline level of psychiatric stability within the hospital, but they issued a dire, uncompromising warning regarding his future. They stated unequivocally that if he were ever allowed to return to the island of Tutuila, or if he were placed in any environment that replicated the intense, suffocating social hierarchy of the Matai system, those invisible pressures would immediately crush his fragile sanity once again, virtually guaranteeing a catastrophic relapse into lethal violence. Therefore, the medical professionals and legal authorities brokered an extraordinary conditional release. Viliama Satel was officially granted his physical freedom, but it came attached with an absolute, uncompromising mandate of permanent banishment. He was legally exiled from American Samoa for the remainder of his natural life. To ensure his continued stability and to protect the public from his latent triggers, he was ordered by the court to relocate immediately to the sprawling, anonymous urban expanse of Los Angeles, California. The rationale behind this decision was as coldly clinical as it was profoundly surreal. The immense geographical scale of the city, the absolute lack of tribal obligations, and the complete absence of the Matai hierarchy provided the exact environmental antithesis to his island home. In the vast, indifferent concrete landscape of Los Angeles, Satel would be a complete nobody. The oppressive collective gaze of the island village would be entirely replaced by the liberating apathy of millions of passing strangers. It was a bizarre, yet scientifically grounded conclusion to a terrifying saga, a legal recognition that for some profoundly damaged human minds, the absolute, cold isolation of a bustling modern metropolis is the only viable cure for the madness induced by the intense pressures of a tropical paradise. The resolution of the legal proceedings did not bring an end to the suffering on the island of Tutuila. Rather, it ushered in a complex, enduring era of communal grief and profound cultural dissonance. For the families of the two innocent victims, the courtroom's pronouncement of not guilty by reason of insanity felt like a second, devastating blow, an abstract, clinical conclusion that entirely failed to address the visceral reality of their heartbreaking loss. In the traditional Samoan context, the restoration of balance after a severe transgression usually involves a highly structured process of apology, tangible restitution, and communal reconciliation orchestrated by the Matai chiefs. The families were culturally conditioned to expect a tangible balancing of the scales, a process where the perpetrator and his extended lineage take direct, public responsibility for the immense harm inflicted. Instead, the Western legal framework had decisively intervened, transforming a horrific blood crime into a complex psychiatric phenomenon, ultimately removing the perpetrator from the island entirely and denying the grieving families the traditional avenues of closure they so desperately needed. The victims left behind empty spaces in their households, unfinished daily chores, and a lingering, suffocating trauma that permeated every corner of the village. Every time the families walked past the location of the tragedy, they were forced to confront not only the brutal absence of their loved ones, but also the terrifying realization that the violence was deemed an unavoidable act of biological fate rather than a punishable act of human malice. The sudden, forced transition back to normalcy was agonizing, as the community was left to grapple with a completely unique type of sorrow, mourning not just the dead, but also the unsettling failure of their ancestral systems to protect them or to provide a satisfying form of justice. The sheer physical beauty of the island, the crashing waves and the vibrant hibiscus, stood in stark, mocking contrast to the darkness that had permanently stained the soil. People returned to their church services, their fishing routines, and their family obligations, but a heavy, unspoken anxiety had settled over the community. The fundamental trust that binds a small, isolated society together had been fractured. Neighbors looked at one another with a newly awakened apprehension, quietly wondering if the intense, inescapable pressures of their shared existence were currently fracturing another vulnerable mind hidden behind a facade of polite compliance. The tragedy forced an introspective reckoning that was deeply uncomfortable, as the elders and community leaders were compelled to reflect on whether the rigid, unyielding demands of their beloved culture could inadvertently become a lethal weapon against their own kin. The grief was not merely personal, it was existential, challenging the foundational myth that their isolated paradise was entirely immune to the chaotic, senseless violence that plagued the outside world. Beyond the shores of American Samoa, the case of Williama Sattel began to echo through the sterile, academic corridors of forensic psychiatry and legal scholarship, rapidly solidifying its status as a foundational text in the study of human behavior. The trial and its highly unusual resolution provided a rare, perfectly documented intersection of organic neurology, cultural anthropology, and modern jurisprudence. For decades, the legal system had operated on a relatively binary understanding of criminal insanity, focusing primarily on conditions like severe schizophrenia, extreme psychosis, or absolute cognitive impairment. However, the Sattel case forced the medical and legal communities to officially recognize and grapple with the concept of culture-bound syndromes, a phenomenon where specific psychiatric distress is inextricably linked to the unique, localized pressures of a particular society. Scholars began to dissect the case to understand how external environmental factors could act as the primary catalyst for a total, catastrophic cognitive collapse in an individual with underlying brain damage. The tragedy on Tutuila vividly demonstrated that the human mind does not operate in a vacuum. Its stability is profoundly dependent on the surrounding social architecture. The psychiatrists who worked on the case published detailed analyses, arguing that the traditional Matai system, with its immense, inescapable demands for absolute submission and collective financial responsibility, functioned as an invisible, psychological pathogen for someone with Sattel's specific neurological vulnerabilities. The case shattered the assumption that all mental illness manifests uniformly across different cultures, proving that the exact same biological defect could remain dormant in a flexible, modern city but become violently lethal in a rigidly structured, geographically confined tribal environment. This realization revolutionized the way forensic evaluators approach defendants from diverse cultural backgrounds, demanding a much more holistic, anthropological investigation into the environmental stressors that might contribute to a sudden, violent outburst. The legacy of the 1981 double murder thus became permanently enshrined in medical textbooks, serving as a grim, undeniable warning about the terrifying power of societal expectations to completely dismantle a fragile human psyche. The ultimate legal disposition of the case, culminating in Sattel's permanent banishment to the sprawling metropolis of Los Angeles in 1982, remains one of the most profoundly ironic and philosophically complex resolutions in modern criminal justice history. On the surface, the court's decision appeared deeply counterintuitive, almost completely absurd. The legal authorities had taken a man who had brutally slaughtered two innocent people in a state of absolute, frenzied madness, and instead of locking him in a subterranean concrete cell for the rest of his natural life, they effectively set him free in one of the most populated, chaotic cities on the planet. Yet this bizarre prescription was rooted in a flawless, clinical logic that entirely subverted traditional notions of public safety. The medical experts recognized that the idyllic, tropical paradise of his homeland was, for Sattel, a lethal pressure cooker, an environment where the constant, intense social monitoring and the heavy, inescapable cultural obligations acted as a continuous, agonizing assault on his damaged nervous system. Conversely, the vast, impersonal concrete jungle of Southern California offered the exact psychological antidote his broken mind required. In Los Angeles, Sattel was entirely stripped of his tribal identity, his ancestral duties, and the suffocating collective gaze of his extended family. He was plunged into an ocean of absolute anonymity, surrounded by millions of strangers who did not know his name, did not care about his lineage, and demanded absolutely nothing from him in terms of communal honor or financial sacrifice. The profound, isolating apathy of the modern American city, a condition that drives so many healthy individuals toward deep depression and unbearable loneliness, became the very mechanism of Sattel's salvation. The overwhelming urban sprawl provided a necessary geographical buffer, absorbing the ambient stress that would have otherwise triggered his violent, uncontrollable impulses. The court's massive gamble proved to be a macabre success, as Sattel faded into the endless, sprawling landscape of the city, living out his days without ever repeating the horrific violence of his past. The banishment served as a chilling, definitive proof of the psychiatrist's foundational thesis, confirming that the monster was not necessarily the man himself, but the specific, toxic reaction between his damaged biology and his native environment. As we look back on the events of 1981, the harrowing story of Viliama Sattel forces us to confront a series of deeply unsettling questions regarding the fundamental nature of human sanity and the invisible, often dangerous boundaries of the societies we construct. We are naturally inclined to view the rules, traditions, and hierarchies of our respective cultures as protective mechanisms, grand social contracts designed to foster unity, preserve order, and safeguard the collective welfare of the community. In the case of the Matai system, these ancient customs had successfully sustained the indigenous population of the Samoan Islands for countless generations, providing a robust framework of mutual support, familial love, and remarkable cultural resilience. Yet, this tragedy reveals a terrifying paradox at the heart of human civilization. The very social structures that are built to hold a community tightly together can simultaneously act as the instruments of absolute destruction for those who fall outside the margins of psychological normalcy. For an individual possessing a hidden, biological fragility, a tightly knit, hyper-observant society ceases to be a sanctuary and rapidly transforms into an inescapable psychological torture chamber. The case demands that we comprehensively reevaluate our rigid understanding of accountability, challenging the comforting illusion that all individuals possess the exact same cognitive capacity to bear the heavy weight of societal expectations. It forces us to acknowledge that sanity is not a rigid, universal constant, but a highly fragile, contextual state of being, constantly negotiated between the internal architecture of the brain and the relentless external demands of the surrounding world. When those external demands become entirely inflexible and escape is rendered geographically or culturally impossible, the human mind is left with no alternative option but to violently fracture. Sattel's sudden descent into unimaginable violence was the catastrophic, deafening sound of that fracture, a desperate, biological rebellion against an environment that demanded a level of cognitive endurance he simply did not possess. This stark realization does not absolve the visceral horror of the act, nor does it wash away the innocent blood that stained the island, but it does fundamentally alter our perception of the perpetrator, transforming him from a figure of pure, calculated evil into a tragic, fundamentally broken casualty of a disastrous environmental collision. In the end, the most haunting legacy of this unprecedented legal saga does not belong to the forensic psychiatrists, the colonial judges, or the man who is quietly banished to the concrete anonymity of Los Angeles. The true, enduring legacy belongs exclusively to the two innocent victims whose lives were so violently and senselessly extinguished on that seemingly ordinary, beautiful afternoon. Their tragic, unprovoked fate serves as a perpetual, somber reminder of the unpredictable, devastating consequences that can occur when the delicate balance between a vulnerable human brain and its surrounding environment is permanently shattered. They were the blameless collateral damage in a hidden, biological war fought entirely within the failing neural pathways of their neighbor. As time continues to march forward, slowly eroding the immediate shock and terror of the 1981 murders, the community of Tutuila continues to honor the memory of those who were lost, carrying their stories forward as a solemn, unyielding testament to the sheer fragility of human life. The complex case of Viliama Satel remains a chilling, monumental chapter in the annals of true crime and psychological jurisprudence, a story that completely defies our traditional human desire for simple motives, logical answers, and clear-cut villains. It leaves us staring quietly into the profound, dark complexities of the human condition, forever questioning the hidden, invisible limits of our own mental endurance when confronted by the inescapable, crushing weight of the world we inhabit. The conclusion of the Viliama Satel saga serves as an enduring, haunting coda to a narrative that began with the brutal disruption of a seemingly idyllic island existence. As the decades have passed since the original investigation, the case has crystallized into a profound, sociological cautionary tale, one that transcends the specific circumstances of the 1981 murders. It forces a continued, uncomfortable meditation on the invisible forces that govern the fragile stability of the human mind within the parameters of a highly structured society. The transition from the acute, localized terror of the crime scene to the broader, abstract discussions of psychiatric jurisprudence reflects the way in which societies often attempt to metabolize and eventually sanitize the most horrific ruptures in their social order. Yet, for those who remain intimately tethered to the history of the case, the memory of what occurred on Tutuila remains resistant to such abstraction. The story is a poignant, lingering reminder that the most devastating tragedies are often those that occur in the blind spots of the law, where the standard definitions of culpability are utterly overwhelmed by the chaotic, internal realities of the human condition. When we strip away the clinical terminology of organic brain damage and the anthropological complexity of the Matai system, we are left with the fundamental, agonizing question of how any individual can truly navigate a world that places such crushing, often invisible burdens upon its inhabitants. The case of Satel highlights that our collective commitment to tradition, to order, and to the maintenance of our social identities often masks a dangerous, latent volatility. We assume that our neighbors are functioning within the same cognitive reality, that they are processing the same environmental pressures with similar levels of resilience, yet the story of 1981 reminds us that the threshold between calm, compliant existence and absolute, explosive disintegration is often thinner than we dare to imagine. The subsequent institutional response to the case, while arguably revolutionary in its acknowledgement of environmental triggers, also highlights the immense, moral ambiguity of justice in such cases. The court's eventual decision to grant Satel unconditional release into the anonymous urban expanse of Los Angeles was a masterstroke of cold, utilitarian logic, yet it left the families of the victims in a state of perpetual, unresolved mourning. Justice, in the traditional, visceral sense, requires a public accounting, a moment where the perpetrator is forced to confront the immense magnitude of the pain they have caused. By shipping Satel off to a distant, indifferent continent, the legal system effectively bypassed that critical, emotional requirement, prioritizing a preventative medical strategy over the basic, human need for emotional restitution. This highlights the inherent tension between the modern, therapeutic approach to justice and the ancient, societal need for vengeance and closure. For the residents of Tutuila, the absence of Satel was not a cure for the trauma. It was an uncomfortable, lingering silence that prevented the community from ever truly moving past the event. The banishment was an administrative success, but it was a communal failure, illustrating the difficulties of applying Western forensic logic to a society where justice is deeply intertwined with interpersonal relationships and collective accountability. This conflict remains at the forefront of ongoing discussions regarding how modern legal systems should handle perpetrators whose actions are deeply embedded in and potentially triggered by their specific cultural contexts. The Satel case continues to be a standard-bearer for this debate, consistently reminding scholars that there is no perfect, clean resolution to a crime that is fundamentally born from the collapse of the social fabric itself. Furthermore, the persistent, haunting nature of this case invites us to reflect on the nature of our own, modern environments and the unique, often invisible pressures they exert upon us. While we may not live under the specific, intense mandates of the Matai system, We operate within our own complex networks of obligation, social surveillance, and environmental confinement. The digital age, with its unrelenting, globalized visibility, creates its own version of the crushing, collective gaze that Sattel experienced. We are constantly scrutinized, constantly expected to perform, and constantly pressured to meet standards of productivity and identity that are often disconnected from our internal, human realities. The sheer, overwhelming noise of modern life can act as its own form of atmospheric pressure, a continuous, low-grade force that can, under the right circumstances, destabilize even the most resilient individuals. The lessons learned from the tragedy on Tutuila are, in this sense, universal. They remind us that the duty of care within any society must extend beyond the enforcement of statutes to a genuine, proactive vigilance regarding the mental well-being of its members. We must be more attuned to the subtle, warning signs of internal fracture, and we must be willing to create spaces where the overwhelming weight of our social expectations can be safely interrogated, questioned, or even, when necessary, discarded for the sake of survival. If we are to prevent the emergence of new, unexpected monsters from the quiet, compliant corners of our communities, we must foster an environment that values the individual's psychological integrity above the rigid, often unquestioned demands of the status quo. The historical trajectory of the 1981 investigation also emphasizes the critical importance of interdisciplinary cooperation in the face of complex, existential threats. The fact that the case was only understood after it was transferred to the hands of medical professionals serves as a profound critique of the traditional, siloed approach to law enforcement and social justice. When the police were acting alone, they were effectively chasing shadows, attempting to solve a mystery that was not rooted in the physical, visible world but in the intangible, invisible pathways of the human nervous system. It was only through the systematic, collaborative integration of psychiatric expertise, neurological analysis, and sociocultural study that the truth of the situation could be surfaced and addressed. This paradigm shift remains a vital, ongoing necessity for modern legal systems. As our societies continue to grow in complexity, as the interplay between biology, technology, and culture continues to deepen, we will increasingly face dilemmas that cannot be deciphered through the application of a single, narrow lens. We must continue to embrace, support, and invest in the intersectional work of experts who can navigate the dark, tangled spaces between medical science and the law. Without such integration, we are perpetually at risk of misinterpreting the manifestations of profound human suffering, treating the symptoms of an internal collapse as if they were merely the calculated choices of a predatory mind. The story of Sattel is, ultimately, a call to humility, a reminder that the world is far more complex than our simplistic narratives of right and wrong would have us believe. Looking forward, the memory of the victims and the harrowing lesson of their demise continue to inform the way we think about the delicate, often precarious nature of communal existence. They act as a silent, moral check on the hubris of our social structures, demanding that we remain constantly aware of the human cost associated with our pursuit of stability and tradition. The case of Viliama Sattel was not a singular, isolated occurrence, but a violent, extreme symptom of an issue that remains deeply relevant to all humanity, the imperative to create social worlds that are not merely functional and hierarchical, but profoundly humane and protective of the vulnerable. It reminds us that every person, regardless of their position within the collective hierarchy, is a complex, fragile entity, deserving of a compassionate consideration that transcends the superficial demands of communal performance. The victims, whose lives were stolen in that sudden, dark, and inexplicable moment, deserved the security that their society was supposed to provide. Their loss is the foundational, unpayable debt that remains at the heart of this entire narrative. As we continue to analyze the legal, psychiatric, and anthropological dimensions of the case, we must always anchor our inquiries in the profound, irreparable loss of those two lives. Their story is the anchor, the reason why we continue to revisit the horrific events of 1981, and the ultimate measure by which we should evaluate the success of our efforts to understand, prevent, and treat the catastrophic ruptures in human sanity. In the final assessment, the case of Viliama Satel serves as an eternal, sobering monument to the complexity of the human spirit when placed in the extreme, unrelenting grip of its own creations. It stands as a powerful testament to the necessity of empathy in the face of the inexplicable and the vital importance of understanding the deep, environmental roots of even the most horrific acts. As we reflect on this long, complex saga, we must remain cognizant of the fact that we are all, in various ways, subject to the invisible, pressing weights of our own societies, and that we are all, to some degree, participants in the creation of the environments that either sustain or destroy our fellow human beings. The resolution of the case, while arguably the most practical available to the authorities at the time, serves as a permanent, haunting placeholder for the fact that some wounds, once inflicted, can never truly be healed, and that some questions, once surfaced, will never find a satisfactory answer. The saga of Satel will persist in the historical, psychiatric, and sociological records not as a concluded, settled event, but as an ongoing, open, and necessary dialogue about the limitations of our laws, the failures of our social architectures, and the enduring, fragile sanctity of the individual mind. It is a story that refuses to be forgotten, not because it provides a satisfying resolution, but because it confronts us, again and again, with the most uncomfortable and essential aspects of our shared human journey. The shadows cast by the volcanic mountains of Tutuila during that fateful year have stretched across the decades, continually inviting us to step into the dark and see what can be learned, what can be understood, and ultimately, how we can better safeguard the sanctity of life against the hidden, mounting pressures that threaten to tear it apart from within. As we close this narrative, we carry with us the somber realization that the path to a truly humane society is a long, arduous, and imperfect one, and that the vigilance required to protect that path is a burden we all, as members of a collective, must ultimately share. The life, the violence, and the ultimate, lonely banishment of Viliama Satel will remain a permanent, vital part of our understanding, forever reminding us that when the structures of our society falter, the first and most tragic victims are always the ones who fall in the spaces between. The conclusion of our exploration into the case of Viliama Satel brings us to a somber point of reflection regarding the nature of memory, the evolution of forensic psychiatry, and the enduring human struggle to find meaning within the wake of profound, senseless destruction. Throughout this series, we have meticulously reconstructed the timeline of a double homicide that fundamentally challenged the judicial and cultural parameters of American Samoa, observing how the violent fracture of one man's mind exposed the invisible, tectonic pressures inherent in a strictly hierarchical, island-bound society. As we cast our gaze forward from the vantage point of the present, the echoes of 1981 continue to resonate, reminding us that every legal case, regardless of how neatly it may eventually be filed away into the archives, leaves behind a persistent ripple effect. The case did not merely end with a verdict or an order of banishment. It initiated a permanent shift in how we conceive of the relationship between the individual and the collective, between the biological realities of the brain and the sociological demands of the culture. It forces us to acknowledge that our social systems are not immutable, natural laws, but rather, human creations that require constant, vigilant maintenance to ensure they do not become engines of suffering for their most vulnerable participants. The Satel case stands as a perennial, cautionary sentinel, standing at the intersection of law and human fragility, waiting to remind us that when we prioritize the preservation of form over the health of the individual mind, the consequences can be nothing short of catastrophic. The legacy of Satel's banishment to the vast urban landscape of Los Angeles serves as a final, profound commentary on the importance of environment as a determinant of sanity. It is a rare, almost singular instance where the legal system acknowledged that a perpetrator was, in a very real sense, a product of his geography, and that the only true path to maintaining a semblance of order was to physically excise him from the catalyst of his collapse. This decision, while controversial and arguably incomplete in its capacity to offer comfort to the grieving, proved to be an undeniably effective psychiatric intervention. It demonstrated that for a mind lacking the inhibitory capacity to filter the relentless, crushing intensity of communal expectation, the only form of protection, both for the perpetrator and for the society, is the total dissolution of those social ties. This is a difficult, uncomfortable truth for any culture to accept, as it suggests that the deepest forms of human connection, the familial, tribal, and historical bonds that anchor our identities, can, under extreme cognitive conditions, become the very elements that dismantle our capacity for moral agency. We are left to ponder the fragility of our own social bonds, wondering how much pressure our own communal structures can sustain before they cease to be sources of identity and support, and instead become sources of profound, destabilizing strain. Furthermore, the scientific advancements that have occurred in the field of neuropsychology since the early 1980s have only served to deepen our understanding of the tragic conditions Sattel faced, validating the defense's claims with a level of precision that was simply not possible at the time of his trial. Modern neuroimaging and sophisticated behavioral profiling have allowed us to map the precise, physiological mechanisms that Sattel's defense team could only theorize. We now possess a much clearer understanding of how structural brain damage specifically impairs the prefrontal cortex's ability to moderate social cues, manage aggressive impulses, and navigate the complex, multi-layered requirements of interpersonal obligations. This burgeoning field of research confirms that the violence observed in 1981 was not an outlier, but a predictable, catastrophic outcome of a system that fails to accommodate biological difference. The legal system today is arguably better equipped to recognize the biological imperatives that drive such behavior, yet the central, ethical dilemma remains. How do we balance the absolute necessity of public safety with a modern, scientifically grounded approach to compassionate, individualized justice? The Sattel case serves as the foundational text for this ongoing, essential struggle, reminding us that until we can reconcile the biological realities of human vulnerability with the rigid requirements of the law, we will remain ill-prepared to address the next tragedy before it unfolds. The memory of the victims, whose names are forever intertwined with this narrative, remains the primary focus of any serious reflection on this case. Their lives, stolen in the prime of their existence, represent the human cost that no psychiatric theory, no legal precedent, and no sociological study can ever truly justify. It is an unpayable debt, a void that will never be filled, and it serves as the ultimate, moral anchor for our inquiry. In the years since, the families of the victims have navigated their own complex, private journeys of grief, largely shielded from the public gaze, and their resilience is a testament to the enduring, quiet strength of the community. They have had to exist in the shadow of a case that turned their profound personal loss into a public, academic, and legal spectacle, and their ability to endure is a profound act of courage. It is essential that we do not let the intellectual curiosity surrounding Sattel's madness overshadow the reality of their loss. We must maintain a clear, unwavering perspective that the focus of our attention is not a psychiatric anomaly, but two individuals who were loved in return, and whose absence has left an indelible, painful mark on the history of their island. Their story is the reason we must continue to interrogate our systems, for it is only through such rigorous, compassionate examination that we can hope to prevent the repetition of such profound, unnecessary agony. As we bring this account to a close, we must recognize that the saga of Viliama Sattel will always remain somewhat open-ended, a narrative that resists a clean, final resolution because the wounds it tore into the fabric of the community were never meant to be easily sutured. It is a story that persists, not because it provides a roadmap to a perfect, just society, but because it challenges us to confront the most inconvenient and uncomfortable truths about our existence. It asks us to consider what we owe to the most fragile members of our community, how we treat the individuals whose internal worlds do not align with our external structures, and what we are willing to sacrifice in the name of tradition. These questions do not possess simple, black and white answers, and perhaps they are not meant to. Perhaps the value of revisiting such a case lies not in the hope of finding a definitive conclusion, but in the process of questioning itself. By continuing to talk about, to study, and to honor the memory of those who were lost in 1981, we perform a necessary, communal act of vigilance. We declare that we have not forgotten, that we refuse to allow the lesson to fade into the obscurity of the past, and that we remain dedicated to the pursuit of a world that is safer, more understanding, and more protective of the individual against the silent, mounting pressures of the collective. The horizon of Tutuila remains as beautiful and as daunting as it was on that fateful day in 1981. The mountains still rise with the same majestic, indifferent grandeur, and the ocean continues its rhythmic, eternal pulse against the volcanic shore. The community of the island has evolved, grown, and transformed in the ensuing decades, yet the story of Satell remains a foundational part of its modern identity, a quiet, somber history that informs the way the island perceives its own internal strength and its own inherent vulnerabilities. We are all participants in the construction of the societies we inhabit, and we all bear a shared, collective responsibility for the environments we create. We must recognize that the integrity of our communities is measured not by how well we handle the peaceful, the productive, or the compliant, but by how we treat the broken, the volatile, and the misunderstood. It is a high, difficult standard, but it is the only one that truly serves the sanctity of human life. As we conclude this examination, we carry with us a deeper, more nuanced appreciation for the delicate, unseen threads that hold our reality together, and a renewed, profound respect for the vigilance required to ensure that those threads do not snap. The case of Williamu Satell will continue to be studied, debated, and remembered, not as a finished historical fact, but as a living, urgent prompt, constantly nudging us toward the challenging work of building a world where the human mind, in all its chaotic, fragile, and magnificent complexity, can be truly understood and protected. It is an endeavor that requires not just our intelligence, but our deepest, most unrelenting empathy, a commitment to see past the surface of the event and into the hearts and minds of those involved. And in the final analysis, perhaps that is the ultimate, necessary takeaway from this entire saga, that in the face of absolute, unbridled madness, our most powerful, effective weapon is not the strength of our laws, but the enduring, quiet persistence of our humanity. May we continue to use it with the wisdom and the care that such a responsibility demands, ensuring that the shadows of the past serve only to illuminate a more conscious, protective, and compassionate future for all. As we step back from the specificities of the 1981 tragedy and the legal aftermath that ensued, we find ourselves standing in the broader light of modern history, reflecting on the enduring echoes of the Williamu Satell case. The narrative of this event is more than a mere chronicle of a double homicide. It is a profound exploration of the fragility of human existence when subjected to the unrelenting forces of tradition and environment. To truly synthesize the lessons gleaned from this long, arduous journey, we must revisit the fundamental intersection of biology and sociology that dictated the collapse of Satell's sanity. The case remains a testament to the fact that every human mind is a unique, biologically rooted architecture, and that this architecture is inextricably linked to the social environment in which it develops and survives. When we consider the lives of the victims, we are reminded that their loss was not merely a casualty of one man's actions, but a consequence of a system that was unable to perceive the warning signs of cognitive decay. It is a sobering realization that calls for a higher degree of vigilance in how we monitor, care for, and integrate those within our communities who may be struggling to navigate the intense currents of their environment. The challenge for contemporary societies, regardless of their cultural structure, is to foster a sense of belonging and duty that does not become a cage, ensuring that the collective identity never eclipses the fundamental necessity of individual psychological safety. The evolution of forensic psychiatry following this case has been nothing short of transformative. By moving beyond the archaic binaries of criminal malice versus institutionalization, the legal system has begun to embrace a more nuanced, anthropologically informed understanding of human behavior. This shift toward viewing the criminal act as a diagnostic, rather than just a moral, phenomenon has paved the way for more humane and evidence-based interventions. It forces us to move beyond the punitive impulses that often define our justice systems and toward a model of justice that seeks to understand the root causes of transgression. This is not to diminish the severity of the act, but to acknowledge that the most effective way to protect the future is to master the lessons of the past. The Satell case serves as a permanent, living document of this progress, a reference point for experts who continue to argue that the law cannot function in isolation from the clinical and sociological realities of the human condition. It is a call to action for the continued integration of interdisciplinary knowledge in the pursuit of a more equitable and insightful justice system. As we advance in our capabilities to diagnose and support, we must ensure that our legal frameworks remain flexible enough to incorporate these advancements, ensuring that the law serves the person as much as it serves the society. There remains a vital, ongoing importance in the act of storytelling itself, the process of taking the raw, brutal fragments of a tragedy and arranging them into a cohesive, meaningful narrative that can be studied and understood by future generations. By documenting the Sattel story with such rigor and empathy, we perform a necessary, communal duty that ensures the lives of the victims continue to have meaning beyond the immediate trauma of their departure. Their stories are not merely historical footnotes, they are the foundation upon which we build a more empathetic and watchful world. It is the act of remembering that protects us from the complacency of believing that such events are rare, isolated, or inherently unpredictable. By holding on to the memory of the 1981 catastrophe, we sharpen our awareness, we deepen our clinical and legal insights, and we strengthen the communal resolve to prioritize the psychological well-being of all members. This pursuit of truth is not just an intellectual exercise, it is an act of preservation, ensuring that the lessons bought at such a high and terrible price are never squandered. As we continue to hold this history in our collective consciousness, we ensure that the voices of the past serve as a persistent, guiding light for the improvements we seek to make in the present and the future. The journey from the shores of Tutuila to the concrete sprawl of Los Angeles represents the total arc of the human experience in this case, the transition from a rigid, ancestral home to a vast, indifferent modernity. This journey was not merely a physical displacement. It was a necessary transformation for a man who could not reconcile the incompatible demands of his world. It raises, for the final time, the question of what we owe to each other in a world that is becoming increasingly connected, yet frequently more indifferent. If we are to honor the legacy of this case, we must strive to create social environments that offer the benefits of community without the crushing weight of total, uncompromising oversight. We must aim to build structures that provide the support of tradition while maintaining the flexibility of modern, individualized care. This is the ultimate, challenging objective of any civilized society, to harmonize the human need for connection with the human need for autonomy and psychological breathing room. It is a delicate, ongoing negotiation, one that requires constant vigilance, deep compassion, and the willingness to learn from the errors of our ancestors. The memory of the 1981 tragedy serves as an eternal, sobering reminder of what is at stake when we fail to negotiate this balance with the necessary grace and humility. As we bring our comprehensive, 8-part inquiry to a final close, we are left with a profound sense of humility. The Viliama Sattel case reminds us that there are forces in the world, both internal and external, that are often beyond our immediate capacity to fully control or understand. We are reminded of the fragility of the human mind, the resilience of the human spirit, and the imperative to approach the most broken among us with a standard of empathy that transcends our instinct for judgment. The saga of this case will continue to be a vital, living part of our discourse, not because it provides a satisfying ending, but because it confronts us with the most uncomfortable, essential elements of our humanity. It is a story of deep loss, of profound misunderstanding, and of an eventual, begrudging acceptance of the limits of our own social constructions. It encourages us to look at our own lives, our own communities, and our own cultural demands with fresh, discerning eyes, and to ask ourselves whether we are creating the environments that foster life and stability, or if we are quietly, inadvertently contributing to the pressure that may eventually lead someone else to the brink. It is a profound, shared responsibility that we all must carry, and it is through this shared sense of duty that we find the path toward a more compassionate, enlightened future. The shadows that stretched across the island of Tutuila in 1981 have, in many ways, become part of our collective heritage. They are the shadows of the unknown, the shadows of the hidden pressures, and the shadows of the fragile mental states that often go unnoticed until it is far too late. By choosing to walk into these shadows, to examine them, and to articulate the lessons they contain, we participate in the collective healing of the social fabric. We do not do this to erase the tragedy, for it is etched in history and can never be undone. We do this to ensure that the light of understanding can penetrate the dark corners where future tragedies might be quietly gestating. We owe this vigilance to the victims, to the survivors, and to the generations who will follow us, ensuring that they inherit a world that is better equipped to handle the complexities of the human mind than the one we have navigated. The story of Williama Sattel is now yours to carry, a complex, difficult, and essential part of the modern lexicon of crime, culture, and psychiatric resilience. May it serve as a guiding, sobering light as we continue our collective, ongoing, and vital work of building a more aware, protective, and truly humane global community. The conclusion of this inquiry is not the end of the conversation, but merely a transition to a more conscious, reflective way of interacting with the world around us. We leave the shores of Tutuila not with simple answers, but with a deeper, more profound set of questions, and with a renewed commitment to the sanctity of the human mind, which remains our most precious and most fragile collective asset. Let this be the final, resonant takeaway, that while we may never achieve a world free from the chaotic, unpredictable forces of human failure, we have, through this deep, careful examination, gained the tools to minimize the harm, to understand the triggers, and most importantly, to extend our empathy to those who, under the right, or rather, the wrong, circumstances, find themselves unable to bear the weight of their own existence. The responsibility is ours, the mission is clear, and the path forward is illuminated by the hard-won insights of a tragedy that will never be truly forgotten, for in the act of remembrance, we honor the lives that were lost and commit ourselves to the safety of all those who remain. As the last echoes of this narrative fade, we are left with a quiet, persistent pulse of human conscience, reminding us that we are our brother's keepers, and that the duty of care is an eternal, non-negotiable part of our shared humanity, one that we must exercise with the unwavering, watchful, and deeply loving attention that the fragile beauty of life so rightfully deserves. This, ultimately, is the highest expression of our collective purpose and the final, enduring meaning we can extract from the long, dark, and complex saga of the 1981 tragedy on Tutuila Island, leaving us forever changed, more alert, and more profoundly committed to the preservation of the individual mind against the silent, mounting pressures of the world. As we stand at the threshold of concluding this extensive exploration into the life, the crime, and the lasting resonance of Williama Sattel, we are forced to reconcile with the reality that some stories do not end in catharsis. They do not conclude with a neat alignment of justice and healing, but instead, they linger as a testament to the unresolved tensions between human biology and the rigid social architectures we build to sustain our cultures. The case, spanning from the lush, volcanic topography of Tutuila to the clinical, concrete expanse of an American hospital, serves as a mirror held up to the human condition in all its precariousness. It is a narrative that has taken us from the suffocating intimacy of the Matai system to the isolating anonymity of the urban sprawl, illustrating the radical lengths required to maintain the fragile equilibrium of a mind already teetering on the edge of destruction. By tracing these steps, we have not only examined the specifics of a 1981 double homicide, but have also engaged in a broader dialogue about the nature of responsibility, the limits of the law, and the inherent, often terrifying, vulnerability of the individual when the collective demands of their environment surpass their neurological capacity to adapt. The journey has been one of deep, often uncomfortable introspection, forcing us to strip away our preconceptions of what constitutes a criminal act and what necessitates a deeper, more compassionate, and scientifically grounded response from the society at large. The institutional transformation that occurred in the wake of the Sattel trial, a transition that saw the legal system cautiously begin to incorporate neuropsychological insight into its foundational processes, stands as the most tangible, lasting legacy of this tragedy. We have witnessed how the rigid, binary focus on intent and premeditation was, by sheer necessity, forced to expand, allowing for a more nuanced recognition of organic cognitive impairment and the role of systemic environmental stress. This shift represents a crucial maturity in the legal consciousness, acknowledging that the courtroom is not just a venue for retribution, but a site where the most complex questions regarding the limits of human autonomy must be confronted. While this progress is undeniably positive, it is a reminder that such wisdom is often purchased at an exorbitant cost, paid for in the currency of innocent lives and the irreparable fracturing of community trust. We must ask ourselves why it required such a catastrophic event to trigger a reevaluation of our legal standards, and we must commit to a more proactive stance in the future, ensuring that we do not wait for the violence to manifest before we begin to address the underlying vulnerabilities that permeate our social systems. This is the moral imperative of the current generation, to build a legal and social framework that anticipates the needs of the vulnerable rather than merely punishing the outcomes of their collapse. Furthermore, the role of community, which we have interrogated at length, emerges from this study as a double-edged sword of immense, contradictory power. The traditional structure of the Tutuila village offered a depth of belonging that is rarely found in the fragmented, transient societies of the modern world. It provided identity, history, and a framework of support that sustained generations, yet it was precisely this intensity of connection, this inescapable, collective scrutiny, that became the catalyst for Satel's undoing. This paradox is a vital, universal lesson. It teaches us that the quality of our communal ties is just as important as their quantity, and that the duty of care within any society must include the recognition of when to release, when to support, and when to create space for those who cannot bear the weight of the collective expectation. We must foster environments that prioritize the individual's mental health, recognizing that a truly strong community is one that can support its weakest members without expecting them to conform to a standard of resilience that is beyond their biological and psychological means. The Satel case teaches us that the preservation of culture should never come at the cost of the individual's basic right to cognitive stability, and that the most durable cultures are those that allow for the greatest degree of internal, individual variation. The story of the victims remains the permanent, silent center of our gravity, the point to which all analysis and reflection must eventually return. It is their loss that provides the ultimate, devastating weight to this narrative, and their memories demand that we treat this case with the utmost solemnity and respect. We have navigated the complexities of Satel's psyche not to exonerate him or to romanticize the act, but to ensure that his tragedy becomes a building block for a more empathetic future. In remembering the lives that were taken, we perform a necessary, communal act of restoration, turning the focus away from the perpetrator's madness and back toward the value of the individuals whose futures were erased. This act of centering the victims is what separates a mere study of crime from a meaningful engagement with human history. It is a commitment to the principle that every life, regardless of its end, carries a dignity that must be honored and a value that must be remembered. As we continue to carry the story of Tutuila in our collective consciousness, we do so with the hope that our deeper understanding will serve as a protective barrier, preventing the recurrence of such avoidable, profound despair. As we conclude this long and complex narrative, we are reminded of the profound interconnectedness of the human experience. Whether we reside in the remote corners of the South Pacific or within the heart of a global metropolis, we are all shaped by the unseen, pressing forces of our own social environments. We are all subject to the internal, biological limitations that define our cognitive realities, and we are all participants in the construction of the societies that hold us. The story of Viliama Satel, with all its discomforts, its complexities, and its enduring, haunting resonance, has forced us to look at ourselves, our institutions, and our obligations to one another with a level of clarity that is as challenging as it is necessary. We leave this inquiry not with the smug comfort of having solved a mystery, but with the sobering, deeply felt responsibility of having understood a part of the human struggle that we must never ignore. The darkness of the 1981 tragedy has been systematically analyzed, mapped, and articulated, and in doing so, we have extracted the light of insight, a light that we must now use to guide our future actions and to temper our societal judgments with the grace of genuine understanding. The final takeaway, then, is one of profound, non-negotiable compassion. We must understand that the next Viliama Satel may already be living amongst us, struggling under the weight of an environment that they cannot articulate and a brain that they cannot control. It is our responsibility to see them, to recognize the signs of their mounting distress, and to offer the support that can prevent the rupture before it occurs. This is the most challenging, most necessary work of our time, to move past our instinct to blame and toward a commitment to proactively sustain the psychological well-being of every person within our reach. We have traveled a long, arduous path through the history of this case, and we have done so with the intention of emerging on the other side with a more sophisticated, more protective, and more profoundly humane perspective. This is the ultimate, enduring resolution we can provide to the victims of 1981 and to the community that was so deeply scarred by their loss. We commit ourselves to this vigilance, we commit ourselves to this empathy, and we commit ourselves to the unwavering belief that understanding the darkness is the only way to ensure that we continue, collectively, to build a future that is defined by the light of awareness, the strength of our connections, and the unwavering sanctity of the human mind. The shadows of Tutuila will always remain, but they are now accompanied by the clarity of our shared commitment, a commitment that we carry forward as we continue the endless, difficult, and essential process of building a world where the human spirit is allowed to flourish, to fail, and to be healed, in the safety and the dignity of an understanding society. As this narrative fades, it leaves behind a permanent, quiet, and resilient hope that we have learned enough to make a difference, that we have grown through the process of inquiry, and that the story of Viliama Satel will continue to serve as a steady, moral compass for those who seek to navigate the turbulent, beautiful, and deeply complex waters of the human journey, forever reminding us that we are one, we are fragile, and we are always, at every turn, responsible for the safety of our neighbor's mind. May this understanding be our strength as we step forward, mindful of the past, vigilant in the present, and deeply, eternally committed to a future where no life is ever lost to the silence of an environment we failed to change, and no mind is ever left to fracture in the darkness of an understanding we failed to reach. With this, we conclude our journey, carrying the weight and the wisdom of this history into the days ahead, forever dedicated to the values that ensure such a profound, collective reckoning can eventually yield a more enlightened and more compassionate way of existing together. In the final analysis of the Viliama Satel case, we find ourselves standing at the intersection of history, law, and the inexorable fragility of the human brain, peering into a landscape that has been irrevocably altered by the tragedy of 1981. This narrative has been an exercise in reconstruction, attempting to weave together the disparate threads of an isolated island culture, the clinical findings of forensic psychiatry, and the stark, unyielding reality of a double homicide that defied conventional explanation. As we reflect on the totality of this journey, it becomes clear that the case was never merely about the actions of one individual. It was a profound, systemic collision between the archaic, structural demands of the Matai system and the biological, often unpredictable limitations of the human mind. We have navigated the geography of Tutuila, a place of immense natural beauty that paradoxically functioned as an atmospheric prison for a man like Satel, and we have confronted the chilling reality of how a society's most sacred traditions can become, for the vulnerable, an unbearable weight that forces a complete collapse of rational inhibitory controls. The act of documenting this history has been a way of honoring the victims and ensuring that their lives remain at the center of the dialogue, serving as the constant, moral reference point that prevents us from falling into the trap of becoming overly enamored with the complexities of the perpetrator's psychology at the expense of the human lives that were silenced. Looking back, the evolution of our perspective on this case mirrors our society's broader, often painful development in understanding mental health within diverse cultural frameworks. In the years that followed the trial, the term culture-bound syndrome became more than just a clinical diagnostic label. It became a bridge for understanding, a conceptual framework that allowed for a dialogue between Western forensic psychiatry and indigenous social structures. This progress was not achieved through simple consensus, but through the hard, grinding work of experts who dared to argue that the environment is not merely a background for human action, but an active, shaping force that can dictate the very parameters of sanity. We have learned that the legal system's capacity for justice is only as strong as its ability to integrate such interdisciplinary insights, and that a blind adherence to static, outdated definitions of criminal intent is a failure that the modern world can no longer afford. The Sattel case, in its stubborn, unsettling complexity, serves as a permanent, living warning against the dangers of institutional short-sightedness, urging us to remain agile, observant, and fundamentally compassionate when we are confronted by behavior that lies outside the narrow margins of our common, everyday experiences. The decision to permanently exile Sattel to Los Angeles remains the most singular, controversial, and ultimately illuminating aspect of this entire historical narrative. It was an act of surgical precision by a legal system that had come to realize that some pathologies are not internal, but relational. They exist in the specific, toxic friction between an individual and their surroundings. By removing him from the suffocating visibility and the crushing, collective expectations of the island, the authorities unwittingly facilitated a test of a psychiatric hypothesis that has since become a cornerstone of our understanding of environment-dependent neuroses. This outcome did not provide the restorative justice that a grieving family might seek, nor did it offer a tidy resolution to the trauma that blanketed the island, yet it provided a pragmatic, life-saving intervention that stands as a testament to the power of environmental adaptation. It forces us to ask deep, unsettling questions about our own lives. How many of us are unknowingly tethered to environments that are slowly eroding our own mental health? How many of us are hiding our own fractures behind the mask of communal performance? And how many of us would find our sanity fundamentally altered if we were removed from the pressures that define our current daily existence? These are the existential questions that the Sattel case continues to pose, long after the legal files have been archived and the immediate shock of the crime has faded into the archives of regional history. As we move forward, it is essential that we carry the lessons of 1981 into the way we design our modern institutions, from our schools and our workplaces to our courtrooms and our hospitals. The mandate of our current era must be the creation of spaces that are sufficiently flexible to accommodate the neurological diversity of the human population. We must move away from a culture of rigid, one-size-fits-all expectation and toward a model of support that recognizes the unique, internal limits of every person. This is not a call for the abandonment of order, but for the creation of an order that is informed by the reality of human vulnerability. If we are to honor the sacrifice of the victims and the profound, life-altering struggle of those who live on the margins of mental stability, we must commit to being the architects of a more protective, more vigilant, and more deeply empathetic social order. The story of Viliama Sattel is no longer just a true crime narrative. It has transcended its original, grim parameters to become a vital, foundational text for anyone committed to the preservation of human dignity in an increasingly complex and interconnected world. It is a text that demands to be read, debated, and applied, for in its pages lies the terrifying, essential truth of our collective, human existence. Ultimately, the act of remembering is a form of communal care. By repeatedly returning to this case, we prevent the hardening of the heart that often follows the exposure to extreme violence. We maintain our sensitivity to the fragile, invisible lines that separate order from chaos, and we sustain our commitment to the belief that even the most broken among us are deserving of an understanding that transcends the primitive instinct for judgment. This series has been an attempt to navigate those lines with as much precision and empathy as possible, providing a comprehensive, scrupulous, and deeply humanizing account of a series of events that will forever remain a dark, defining marker in the history of American Samoa. We have looked at the geography, we have consulted the science, we have walked the path of the legal defense, and we have kept the victims at the forefront of our conscience. In doing so, we have performed a duty that is essential for the health of any community, The duty of ensuring that the shadows of the past are not allowed to consume the light of our current understanding, but are instead used to illuminate the path toward a more conscious and protective future. As this, our 11th and final segment, brings our extensive inquiry to a close, we find that the mystery of the Sattel case has not been solved so much as it has been deeply, thoroughly accepted. We accept that the tragedy was a result of circumstances that were both profound and fundamentally tragic, and we accept that our ability to understand such things is an evolving, lifelong process of discovery. We carry the weight of this knowledge, not as a burden, but as a lantern, a source of illumination that we can use to guide our future interactions and our future societal improvements. The story of Tutuila Island, of the lives lost, and of the man who became a monster in the eyes of his community, but a victim in the eyes of his biology, is now a part of our intellectual and emotional landscape. It is a story that requires us to be more than just observers. It requires us to be active, empathetic participants in the protection of each other's humanity. As we walk away from this series, let us do so with a renewed, profound respect for the fragility of the mind, a commitment to the interdisciplinary work that makes justice more humane, and an unwavering, persistent devotion to the well-being of the individuals who compose the collective. The silence that now returns to the island, the quiet, rhythmic breaking of the waves upon the volcanic rock, is a silence that is now informed by the story we have told. It is a silence that feels slightly different, heavier with the knowledge of what occurred, yet perhaps more resolved in its understanding of the human condition. The lives of the victims are enshrined in this narrative, their names and their presence honored through the depth and the gravity of our analysis. We have done the work that was required. We have traversed the dark spaces of the Sattel saga, and we have emerged on the other side with a clearer, more resolute commitment to the values of empathy, vigilance, and understanding. This is our final, enduring contribution to the history of this case, and it is a contribution that we hope will stand as a testament to the power of human connection, even in the face of the most profound, inexplicable destruction. Let the narrative serve as an ongoing, living guide, a persistent nudge toward a world where no life is lost to the silence of misunderstanding, and no mind is ever forced to face the darkness alone. We are the stewards of this history now, and it is our collective, ongoing responsibility to use it wisely, to keep the dialogue open, and to ensure that the sanctity of the human life and the fragility of the human mind remain at the very core of our shared, societal purpose forevermore.